Close your eyes, breathe slowly. Let the weight of the day dissolve from your shoulders, and let the darkness around you become something generous, the darkness of the space between what was and what comes next, the darkness that is not an ending but the pause before a beginning. Tonight we listen to the people who lost everything, not almost everything. Everything, the house, the marriage, the business, the health, the identity, the version of the future they had been building for years. We listen to what happened next. We listen to what they found in the rubble that they could not have found any other way, and what they want the people who are in their own rubble right now to understand. This is their testimony. It was earned in the hardest school available. It is offered here freely. 1. The bottom is solid ground. There is a paradox at the center of the experience of losing everything that the people who have been through it describe with a consistency that makes it something close to a law. The bottom, when it is finally reached, the genuine bottom, the place where there is nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear losing, turns out to be solid. Not comfortable, not safe in any ordinary sense, but solid in the way that the truth is solid, reliable, unambiguous, impossible to fall through. The terror of the descent toward the bottom is, in the accounts of people who have made it, considerably worse than the bottom itself. The descent is the period of the losing, the sequential stripping away of the things that had been understood as the foundations of the life, each loss producing the fear that the next loss will be the one that finally exceeds the person's capacity to absorb it. This fear is real and it is not irrational. But what it consistently fails to predict is the quality of what remains when the losing is finished. What remains when everything external has been removed is the person. Just the person, without the house or the marriage or the career or the accumulated identity that those things had been constructing around them for years. And the person, it turns out, is enough to stand on. The people who describe this discovery do not describe it as a pleasant surprise. Nothing about reaching the bottom is pleasant, and the honest ones do not pretend otherwise. They describe it as a structural surprise, the discovery that the self, stripped of everything it had been using as external support, was more durable than the accumulation of external supports had allowed it to appear. All those years, the house and the career and the social position had been understood as the foundation. They were not the foundation, they were the furniture. The foundation was always the person. The loss was what removed the furniture long enough for the foundation to be seen. The wisdom this discovery produces is not available through any other means. It cannot be arrived at through philosophical reflection, or through the reading of books, or through the sincere imaginative effort of the person who has not yet been required to find out what they are made of in the conditions that make the finding out necessary. It is knowledge of the specifically empirical kind, knowledge, that requires the experiment to be run, that cannot be approximated through the theoretical consideration of its results. They ran the experiment. The results surprised them. The bottom, it turned out, was solid, and the solidity of it, the plain, undecorated, impossible to deny solidity of the self standing on itself, was the first and most important thing the rebuilding had to stand on. 2. Identity is not what you own. One of the most disorienting dimensions of the experience of major loss. Disorienting not because the philosophical distinction between person and possession is unavailable to a thoughtful person before the loss, since of course it is available, but because the abstract knowing of a thing and the embodied experiencing of it are genuinely different, and the gap between them is not closed by any amount of prior intellectual preparation. Is the discovery of how completely the prior identity had been constructed from the things that were lost. The house was not just a house. It was the person who owned that house, in that neighborhood, whose children grew up in those specific rooms and whose neighbors knew them by that address. The career was not just a job. It was the person who did that work, who was known for that competence, who belonged to that professional world, and whose days were organized around its rhythms and its demands. When the house and the career are gone, the question that arrives alongside the loss is not only the practical question of what to do next. It is the more unsettling question of who, exactly, is doing it. The people who have been through major loss and who have come out the other side with a rebuilt life describe the period of this identity disorientation as one of the most frightening and the most ultimately valuable passages of the whole experience. Frightening because the human being is not well equipped to inhabit a condition of genuine identity uncertainty. We are creatures of narrative, creatures of the continuous story of the self, and the loss of the chapter that was supposed to come next leaves a disorientation that the practical urgencies of the rebuilt life do not immediately address. Valuable because the disorientation is also a freedom, the freedom of the person who is not yet committed to the next version of themselves, who has not yet rebuilt the identity around the next set of external markers, and who is therefore briefly and genuinely available to choose more deliberately than the incremental accretion of ordinary life tends to allow. The conventional life does not often require a person to ask seriously who they are outside the roles they occupy. The roles provide the answer before the question fully forms. The loss removes the roles and leaves the question standing undefended in the middle of the cleared space. This is uncomfortable in a way that is genuinely difficult to adequately describe. It is also, in the experience of the people who eventually found an answer, one of the most important questions they ever had the conditions to ask. They would not have asked it without the loss. The answer, when it came, changed what they built next and why they built it and for whom. 3. The people who stayed. Among the many things that major loss reveals about the self, about the nature of the life that was lost, about the world that surrounds the person who is in the middle of the losing, none is more immediately and more permanently clarifying than what it reveals about the people in the life. The revelation is simple in its mechanics and significant in its consequences. You find out, in the conditions of the genuine emergency, who your people actually are. Not who you believed them to be, not who they appeared to be in the ordinary conditions of the ordinary life, when appearing well was easy and cost nothing. Who they actually are, which is visible only in the conditions where showing up costs something and where the person who does not show up incurs no penalty that the social world will enforce. The loss creates exactly these conditions. What they reveal is not always what was expected. The people who go are not always the ones who would have been predicted to go. Sometimes the relationships that seemed most solid, the professional connections of years, the social friendships built in the comfortable decade, the acquaintances whose warmth seemed genuine and whose presence in the good times was reliable, prove, in the conditions of the loss, to have been relationships of proximity and shared circumstance rather than genuine attachment. Relationships that served both parties well in the ordinary life and that could not survive the removal of the ordinary life that made them functional. This discovery is painful. It is also, in retrospect, consistently described as clarifying, as the removal of something that was consuming resources it was not returning, whose removal, however unwelcome, ultimately freed the person from the maintenance of a connection that was not what it had appeared to be. The people who stay are the revelation worth receiving. They are sometimes surprising, the neighbor who appeared without being called, the old friend who had been out of contact for years and who somehow knew and came, the colleague who did something small but exactly right at the moment when exactly right was what was needed. These people whose presence in the conditions of the loss was not required by any obligation and was therefore entirely the product of their own character become the foundation of the rebuilt social world. The loss was the filter. The people who came through it were the ones worth building the next chapter around. The loss, among its other costs, provided the most accurate inventory of the actual relationships in the life that any less extreme circumstance could have produced. For grief is not linear, and neither is recovery. The cultural narrative of recovery from major loss tends to present it as a progression, a movement through identifiable stages toward a destination that can be called healed, rebuilt, moved on. The people who have been through the experience describe something considerably less orderly and considerably more honest than this progression narrative accommodates. Recovery does not move in a single direction. It circles back. It produces good days followed by terrible days, followed by ordinary days, followed by days so unexpectedly good that the person experiencing them is briefly convinced the worst is over, followed by days that suggest the worst is not over at all. This nonlinearity is not a malfunction of the recovery process. It is the recovery process, as it actually exists, before the cultural narrative has smoothed it into the shape that the cultural narrative finds more comfortable to present. This is one of the most important things that the people who have been through major loss want the people currently in the middle of it to understand, because the linear narrative produces a suffering that is entirely unnecessary. The suffering of the person who is on a bad day in the middle of an apparently good stretch, and who concludes from the badness of the day that they have somehow failed at the recovery, that the good days were a deception, that the whole project of rebuilding is more fragile than it appeared. The bad day is not a regression. It is the texture of the process, which is not a smooth ascent, but a genuine human experience with all the irregularity that genuine human experiences contain. Knowing this, genuinely knowing it, not as an abstraction, but as an expectation that the bad day confirms rather than contradicts, changes the relationship to the bad day from evidence of failure to evidence of the process proceeding as processes actually proceed. The practical wisdom of this understanding is the wisdom of patience with the nonlinear path, patience with oneself on the days when the path doubles back, and patience with the people around the person in recovery who may be measuring the recovery against a narrative timeline that the actual recovery has no obligation to follow. They were not behind schedule. The schedule they were on was the right one. It simply did not resemble the one the culture had described. 5. What you actually need is less than you thought. Among the most consistently surprising discoveries of the period of rebuilding after major loss, surprising not as an abstract philosophical proposition, but as a lived, daily experience that arrives in the body before it arrives in the mind, is the discovery of how much less is actually required for a life of genuine quality than the prior life had suggested. The person who had the large house and the many rooms and the accumulated weight of years of possessions, who found themselves after the loss in a small apartment with a fraction of what they had owned, and who expected to feel the deprivation as a continuous absence, describes instead something they did not anticipate: a lightness, an ease of maintenance, a freedom from the management of the prior abundance that the prior abundance had made it impossible to perceive as a burden. Because when a burden has been present long enough, it stops registering as a burden and becomes simply the weight of the ordinary life. The reduction in material complexity that major loss forces tends to produce in the people who eventually arrive at the rebuilt life and look back at the prior one with the clarity of the distance, an assessment that the prior standard of living was carrying costs, in time, in maintenance, in anxiety about the maintenance, in the specific quality of the psychological weight of the accumulated that were not apparent from inside the accumulation. The thing that is owned also owns the owner. The thing that must be maintained also demands the maintenance. The life organized around a certain level of material complexity is a life organized around the service of that complexity, whether or not the person living it is fully conscious of the service being rendered. The wisdom of the rebuilt life, which is in most cases materially simpler than the life it replaced, is the wisdom of the recalibrated baseline, the discovery, available only in the conditions of the loss of the prior baseline, that the sufficiency line was lower than the prior lifestyle had placed it. They needed less. The knowing of this was not available from inside the life that had more. The loss provided the perspective that the abundance had made impossible. What they rebuilt was smaller, lighter, and in ways that surprised them, better maintained, including the maintaining of themselves within it. 6. Starting over is terrifying and possible at the same time. The emotional reality of starting over, of standing at the beginning of the rebuilt life, with the full knowledge of what building costs and what the built thing can lose, is described in the testimony of people who have been through it as one of the most paradoxical emotional experiences available to the adult human being. Genuinely terrifying and genuinely possible at the same time, in a combination that the person in the middle of it cannot always perceive as a combination, because the terror tends to occupy the foreground, and the possibility tends to become visible only in retrospect, when the person who was terrified is able to look back and see that they were also, all along, capable. The terror is not irrational. The person who has lost everything has direct empirical evidence that the things they build can be lost, evidence that the person who has not been through major loss does not have in the same immediate and personal form. The rebuilt life is being constructed by a person who knows, from direct experience, that fragility is real, and that the catastrophe is not a theoretical possibility that applies to other people in other circumstances, but a thing that happened to them in their life. This knowledge makes the starting over harder in some respects than the original building was. The original building was done in the relative innocence of a person who had not yet experienced the full cost of losing what they built. The rebuilding is done in full awareness. And yet the people who rebuilt describe the rebuilding as possible in a way that also exceeds what the original building was, possible in the way that things are possible when they are genuinely chosen. When the person doing the building has been clarified by the loss about what is actually worth building, and what the prior life had been building out of habit or expectation rather than genuine desire. The rebuilt life tends to be smaller, simpler, and more deliberately theirs than the life that was lost. Both things are true simultaneously. The terror is real, and so is the possibility. The people who rebuilt lived in both truths at once. That coexistence, uncomfortable as it was the actual condition of the starting over. There was no version of it in which the terror was absent. There was also no version in which the possibility was not real. 7. The story you tell about it matters. Among the many variables that the psychological research on resilience and recovery consistently identifies as significant determinants of the trajectory of the rebuilt life, one of the most powerful and the most directly within the person's own control is the story they tell about what happened. Not the facts of the loss, which are what they are and cannot be revised, but the meaning assigned to those facts, the narrative framework within which the loss is understood and described and offered to the self and to the people around them. This is not a counsel to falsify the account or to perform a resilience that is not felt. It is the observation that the same events, organized within different narrative frameworks, produce different subsequent lives, not because the events change, but because the person's relationship to the events changes depending on how they are understood. The narrative of the person who rebuilt tends to differ from the narrative of the person whose recovery stalled in a way that reflects a fundamental difference in the relationship between the person and the experience. The narrative of the person who rebuilt is not a narrative of victimhood, not because they were not harmed, not because the loss was not real and significant, and in many cases entirely undeserved, but because the narrative of victimhood, however accurate in its account of what happened, assigns to the person a passivity in relation to what comes next that the rebuilding cannot afford. The person who is primarily the victim of what happened to them is not primarily the agent of what happens next. The rebuilding requires agency, and agency requires a story in which the person has some. The most useful narrative is not the narrative that denies the harm or that converts the loss into a gift through the insistence that everything happens for a reason. It is the narrative that holds both the reality of the harm and the reality of the agency, that says honestly, this happened, it was real, it cost what it cost, and I am the person who is deciding what comes next. That narrative does not make the loss smaller. It makes the person larger than the loss. The people who rebuilt found this narrative, each in their own time and in their own way. The finding of it was one of the most important things they did. 8. The rebuilding takes longer than anyone tells you. The timeline of recovery from major loss is one of the most consistently and most harmfully underestimated dimensions of the experience, underestimated by the person going through it, by the people around them, and by the cultural narratives of resilience and fresh starts that present the rebuilt life as the reasonably near destination of a motivated person's effort. The people who have been through it and who speak honestly about the timeline describe a process that takes years, sometimes many years, not because the person is doing it wrong or failing to apply sufficient will or effort, but because the genuine rebuilding of a life, not the surface reconstruction of the external markers of stability, but the interior rebuilding of confidence and identity and the relationship with the future that major loss consistently disrupts, takes the time it takes. And the time it takes is more than the surrounding culture tends to allow for. The pressure to be done with it, to be over the loss and back to normal, to stop being the person to whom the bad thing happened, and to start being the person who has dealt with it and moved on. is one of the most consistently described sources of unnecessary suffering in the recovery period. It arrives from multiple directions, from friends and family whose own discomfort with the ongoing difficulty produces an impatience that is experienced by the person in recovery as a judgment of their pace, from the cultural narrative of the bounce back that implies that the person who has not yet bounced back has something to answer for, and from the person themselves, whose own desire to be done with the pain produces a self-criticism when the pain continues past the point at which they believed it should have ended. The wisdom is the wisdom of the true timeline, the permission to take the time the rebuilding actually requires without the additional weight of the shame of needing that time. The rebuilt life is worth taking the time for. The person in the middle of the rebuilding is not behind any schedule that matters. They are moving at the pace that the reality of the loss produced, and that pace is the right one for the work that is being done. 9. What was lost that you did not expect to miss? The losses that arrive in the aftermath of major loss, the secondary losses, the things that were not themselves the subject of the disaster, but that the disaster removed as a consequence of removing the primary thing, are among the most consistently underprepared for dimensions of the experience. The person anticipating the loss tends to focus their preparation on the primary loss and to discover only in the lived experience of the aftermath the full range of what the primary loss was attached to and what its removal therefore also removed. The marriage that ended took with it not only the marriage, but the couple-based social world, the shared future plans, the identity of the partnered person, the specific vision of the agging years that had been constructed around the presence of the other person. The career that ended took with it the professional identity, the daily structure, the community of colleagues, the sense of purpose that the work had provided each morning. These secondary losses are real losses with their own grief, and they arrive on top of the primary loss in ways that the person in the middle of the experience is not always equipped to separate and name individually. They tend to be absorbed into the general weight of the primary grief without being identified as distinct losses deserving of their own acknowledgement, and this absorption produces a grief that feels shapeless and overwhelming in a way that would be somewhat more manageable if its components were visible. The person who is grieving not only the marriage, but the social world and the identity and the future plans is grieving many things at once, and the many things deserve to be named. The wisdom this dimension of the experience offers is the wisdom of the full inventory, of allowing the grief to be as large as the loss actually was, which is almost always larger than the primary loss alone accounts for. The person who names the secondary losses is not being excessive in their grief. They are being accurate about the actual scale of what happened. Accuracy is the beginning of the honest accounting. The honest accounting is the beginning of the genuine rebuilding. 10 Lessons at 10. The rubble has a foundation. We have arrived at the 10th lesson in our journey through the testimony of the people who lost everything and started over. And already the shape of what they most want to say has begun to emerge with clarity from beneath the rubble of the losses they describe. What they want us to understand, across all the different forms the loss took and all the different circumstances in which the starting over was required, is that the bottom is solid, that the person who reaches it intact has something to stand on that the comfortable life did not require them to find, and that the finding of it, however unwelcome the conditions that necessitated the finding, produced in them an understanding of themselves and of the actual foundations of a genuine life, that the comfortable years had made it entirely possible to spend a lifetime without arriving at. They lost the house and found out they were not the house. They lost the marriage and found out they were not the marriage. They lost the career and found out they were not the career. They lost the story they had been telling about who they were and found out that the person beneath the story was more capable, more durable, and more genuinely interesting than the story had been giving them credit for. In the first 10 lessons, we have heard the beginning of this account, the account of the descent, the discovery of the bottom, the revelation of the people who stayed, the nonlinearity of the recovery, the sufficiency of less, the paradox of the starting over, the importance of the narrative, the honest timeline, and the full inventory of what was lost. The rubble is real. What is visible through the rubble is the foundation. It was always there. The loss made it visible. In the 90 lessons that remain, we will follow the people who built on it. This is explored during Sleeping 11, the unexpected kindness of strangers. Among the things that the people who lost everything most consistently describe as having surprised them during the period of the loss, during the months when the practical and emotional weight of the disaster was at its most acute, and when the resources available to meet it felt most inadequate, is the kindness of people who had no particular obligation to offer it. Not the kindness of the close relationships whose support was expected and whose absence would have been a secondary wound on top of the primary one, but the kindness of the stranger, the acquaintance, the person at the edge of the social world whose appearance in the conditions of the emergency was not predicted and whose response to it was not required by any social expectation that the person could have named. The forms this kindness took vary as widely as the circumstances of the losses themselves. The landlord who agreed to terms that the market did not require. The former colleague who passed along a connection that opened a door that would otherwise have remained closed. The neighbor who left food at the door without knocking and without leaving a note that would have required a response. The stranger in a waiting room whose brief, genuine acknowledgement of a visible distress cost them nothing and registered with a warmth entirely disproportionate to its duration. These moments are described in the testimony not as the turning points of the recovery. The recovery required more than any individual act of kindness could provide, but as the evidence, arriving at the moment when evidence was most needed, that the world was not entirely indifferent to what was happening. The wisdom this dimension of the experience deposits is not the sentimental wisdom of the restored faith in humanity that the cultural narrative of the inspiring story tends to produce. It is something more measured and more durable. The observation that kindness, distributed across the broad social world in forms that are invisible until the conditions that make them visible arrive, is more present than ordinary life tends to reveal. The comfortable life does not require the stranger's kindness and therefore does not encounter it. The emergency does require it, and in the requiring reveals it. The people who were helped by these small, unexpected acts carried them forward as a specific motivation, to be, in other people's emergencies, the person who appeared. 12. The discovery that you were more resilient than you knew. The self-knowledge that major loss produces, the knowledge of what one is actually made of in the conditions that reveal the composition most accurately, is among the most enduring and the most practically valuable changes that the experience deposits in the person who passes through it. It is knowledge that cannot be approximated through self-assessment in the comfortable life, because the comfortable life does not create the conditions that the knowledge requires. It cannot be produced by will or imagination or the sincere desire to know. It requires the conditions that the comfortable life most specifically works to prevent. And when those conditions arrive, uninvited and unwelcome, they provide the test that no other circumstance could have provided, and whose results the person carries forward as a permanent recalibration of what they believe themselves capable of. The discovery is almost always surprising in the same direction. The person who feared they would not be able to manage finds out that they managed. Not easily, not without cost, not without the full weight of the difficulty being felt in the full range of its dimensions, but managed in the sense that the day was survived, and then the next day was survived, and then the week was survived, and then the month, until the surviving had accumulated into a period that could be seen in retrospect as a period that was gotten through rather than a period that was not. This is not a small thing. The getting through of the genuinely difficult period is the empirical demonstration, conducted in real conditions with real stakes, that the person's capacity for difficulty is greater than the prior estimate of that capacity had suggested. What changes when this discovery has been made and has had time to settle into the person's understanding of themselves is the relationship to the next difficulty, not the grandiose confidence of the person who believes they cannot be broken, but the quieter and more useful confidence of the person who has direct evidence that breaking is not the only available outcome of the hard thing. They have been through something hard. They are still here. The evidence is in the surviving, and the surviving is now part of who they are. 13. The first day that felt almost normal. The first day that felt almost normal. The first day on which the loss did not arrive as the first thought of the morning, on which the ordinary demands of the ordinary hours were present enough to occupy the attention that grief had been consuming, on which the person moved through the world with something closer to the unremarkable quality of the unremarkable day than anything that had been available in the weeks or months preceding it, is described in the testimony of people who rebuilt their lives as one of the most significant and most emotionally complicated days of the entire recovery period. It is significant because it is the first evidence, experienced directly rather than believed on the basis of what others have promised, that the recovery is real and that the ordinary life is returning. The almost normal day is the specific, bodily, irreplaceable demonstration that what seemed in the depths of the loss, like a permanent state of the world, is not permanent, that the world has moved, that something has shifted, without announcement and without drama, in the direction of the ordinary. This evidence cannot be fully received at second hand. It has to be experienced to be believed, and in the experience, it produces a specific quality of gratitude that the words available for gratitude do not quite reach. It is complicated because the almost normal day arrives alongside the awareness of the loss, and the contrast between the almost normality of the day and the reality of what was lost can produce a guilt that the almost normality does not deserve. The guilt of the person who feels that having an ordinary day is a betrayal of the grief, that the capacity to move through the morning without the weight being the primary feature of the moving is somehow a diminishment of the significance of the thing that was lost. The people who rebuilt worked through this guilt not by arguing against it, but by allowing it to be present alongside the almost normality, by understanding that the two things, the grief and the resumption of the ordinary, were not contradictions but companions, and that the almost normal day was not a betrayal of the loss, but the beginning of the life that would carry the loss forward. 14. The things they let go of that they thought they never could. Among the changes that the experience of major loss and subsequent rebuilding produces in the people who pass through it, one of the most practically consequential and the most personally significant is the change in the relationship to the things they were holding, the grievances, the identities, the obligations, the versions of the past that had been maintained through sustained effort, that the loss made it possible and eventually necessary to release. Not because the releasing was desired or chosen in any straightforward sense, but because the conditions of the loss made the continued maintenance of these things too costly for the available resources, and the releasing of them, however involuntary its initial occasion, turned out to produce a relief that the maintenance had been preventing. The person who had been maintaining for years a version of themselves that was organized around the career that the loss ended, who had defined their worth, their daily schedule, their social standing, and their sense of the future through the frame of that career, discovered in the loss of the career the simultaneous loss of an obligation to maintain that version of themselves. The thing that had been the anchor was also the chain. The loss of the anchor and the chain arrived together, and the relief of the chain's removal was present alongside the grief of the anchor's loss, in a mixture that was not simple and that took time to separate into its components. The wisdom this dimension of the experience offers is not the counsel to seek loss as a mechanism of liberation. The loss was real and its costs were real, and the releasing of the things that were attached to what was lost was not a gift that was freely given, but a consequence that was painfully attached to the catastrophe. It is the more careful observation that the things which were released in the conditions of the loss had been, in some cases, heavier than the ordinary life's incremental accumulation had made them appear. The loss made the weight visible. The visible weight, released, lightened what was rebuilt. 15. What shame did and how they broke through it. Shame is one of the least discussed and most consequential dimensions of the experience of major loss, least discussed because the cultural silence around certain forms of loss, the financial failure, the divorce that was not desired, the addiction that consumed what was accumulated, the collapse that arrived in a context that the surrounding culture tends to associate with personal failure rather than with circumstance, is itself partly produced by the shame that attaches to those losses, and that makes their honest discussion a further exposure of the very vulnerability that the shame is working to conceal. Shame, in the conditions of the major loss, functions as the loss's shadow, the secondary wound that is inflicted not by the event itself, but by the person's own interpretation of the event as evidence of a fundamental inadequacy in themselves. The people who broke through the shame, who arrived, by whatever path, at the ability to speak honestly about the loss, without the performance of the composed and managed version that shame tends to produce, describe the breakthrough not as the elimination of the shame, but as the withdrawal of its power over their behavior. The discovery that the honest account of the loss, offered in the conditions of genuine trust, produced not the judgment and rejection that the shame had been predicting, but the recognition and the connection that the honest account, when it is genuinely received, tends to produce. The person who heard the honest account and stayed, who received it without flinching, without withdrawing, without offering the reassurance that quietly demanded the performance to resume, was the person whose staying was the most important evidence available that the shame's predictions were wrong. The practical wisdom of this experience is the wisdom of the calculated risk of the honest account, not the wholesale public disclosure of the loss's most painful dimensions to every available audience, but the careful, deliberate, selective disclosure of the true account to the specific person whose demonstrated trustworthiness makes the disclosure reasonably safe. The shame loses its power in the testimony of the people who rebuilt, not through argument or through will, but through the repeated experience of the honest account being received and survived. Each surviving diminishes the shame's authority. The diminishment accumulates. The shame does not disappear. It becomes, gradually and through the accumulation of the honest accounts that were survived, less than the person carrying it. 16. The dead end that was actually a door. The moment that is experienced, in the conditions of the loss, as the final closing, the foreclosure of the last available option, the door that was the last door and that has now been shut, is described in the testimony of people who rebuilt as one of the experiences most likely to be revised by the subsequent arc of the recovery. Not always, and not quickly, and not without the genuine despair that the apparent closing produces at the time of its occurrence, but with a frequency that is striking enough in the testimony to constitute a pattern rather than a coincidence. The moment that seemed like the end of available options was the moment that preceded the discovery of options that the prior orientation toward the loss had made invisible. The mechanism is not mysterious, though it is real. The person who is pursuing the recovery of the lost life, who is directing their energy toward the reconstruction of what was, and whose attention is therefore organized around the absence of what was, is oriented away from the possibilities that are not the lost thing. The closing of the last door toward the lost thing is also, potentially, the releasing of the attention from the pursuit of the lost thing, and the released attention is available to perceive possibilities that the pursuit had been obscuring. The dead end is the end of the road toward the specific destination that was being pursued. It is not the end of all roads. But it feels like the end of all roads, and in the conditions of the major loss, it is experienced as the end of all roads, and the despair that the feeling produces is real. The people who eventually found the door that the dead end was hiding in front of do not offer this as a promise that every dead end conceals a door. They offer it as the testimony of their own experience, which is all that testimony can offer. That in their case, the thing that appeared to be the final closing was not the final closing, and that the discovery of this was only possible after the door toward the prior destination had been genuinely accepted as closed. The acceptance was the condition of the seeing. The seeing required the acceptance. 17. The worst-case scenario was survivable. One of the most practically useful things that the experience of major loss provides to the person who passes through it is the direct demonstration, at the level of the embodied and the lived rather than the theoretical and the imagined, that the worst-case scenario, the thing that the anxiety of the comfortable life had held up as the catastrophe whose avoidance justified the various compromises and constraints of the ordinary life, is survivable, not pleasant, not painless. Not without genuine cost and genuine difficulty and genuine duration, but survivable, and the knowledge of the survivability of the worst case earned through the direct experience of surviving it rather than through the abstract reasoning about it that the comfortable life provides, is one of the most genuinely useful pieces of self-knowledge available to a human being. The culture of anxiety that organizes a significant portion of ordinary adult life operates primarily through the imagined catastrophe, the thing that would happen if the risk were taken and it went wrong, the collapse that would follow the failure, the judgment that would arrive if the exposed vulnerability was seen. The catastrophe is held in the imagination at a level of vividness that is sufficient to deter the risk-taking or the vulnerability or the genuine attempt, and the deterrence is maintained by the fact that the catastrophe has not actually been experienced and therefore cannot be accurately assessed. Its power derives from its hypothetical status. The unknown worst case can always be worse than the known one. The person who has lived through the actual worst case, who has had the divorce, who has lost the business, who has been publicly failed, has replaced the hypothetical worst case with the known one. And the known one, whatever its genuine costs, is bounded. It has a specific size, it has a duration, it is not infinite. The anxiety can no longer claim that the worst case might be worse than the worst case actually was, because the worst case actually was, and the person is still here, and the actual dimensions of the catastrophe are now known rather than imagined. This knowledge, the knowledge of the bounded size and the survivable duration of the actual worst case, does not make the future risk-free. It makes the future's risks less effectively deterring. 18. The body knew how to start. Among the discoveries that the people who rebuilt after major loss describe as having been most important in the practical mechanics of the starting over, the actual day-to-day navigation of the early period of the reconstruction. One of the most consistently identified and the most underrepresented in the cultural narrative of the rebuilt life is the role of the body. The discovery that the physical engagement with the ordinary demands of physical existence, the walk taken in the early morning before the mind had fully assembled its inventory of the difficulty, the work done with the hands that occupied the attention at the level of the sensory and the immediate, the simple bodily rhythms of eating and sleeping and moving that continued through the conditions of the loss with a reliability that the interior life did not match, was not merely a backdrop to the recovery, but an active participant in it. The body's continuity through the conditions of the major loss is one of the most quietly significant features of the experience. The loss was, in most cases, primarily an interior and relational catastrophe. The loss of the marriage, the career, the financial position, and the body continued through the catastrophe to perform its ordinary functions with a consistency that the interior experience was not providing. It was hungry at the ordinary times. It was tired at the ordinary times. It required the ordinary maintenance of the ordinary physical existence, regardless of the severity of the interior crisis, and the maintenance of the body's ordinary rhythms through the conditions of the crisis was, in the testimony of people who rebuilt, one of the anchors that kept the recovery attached to the ordinary world, while the interior was doing the less tractable work of the rebuilding. The wisdom this offers is practical and immediate. When everything else is uncertain, the body knows what to do next. Get up, walk, eat something real, sleep when sleep is available. The body's ordinary demands are not a distraction from the recovery. They are the recovery's most reliable scaffolding, the structure that holds the person in the ordinary world while the interior finds its way back to it. 19. What they stopped apologizing for. One of the changes that the experience of major loss produces in the people who rebuild, a change that tends to arrive not at the bottom, but somewhere in the middle of the rebuilding, when enough of the reconstruction has occurred to provide a stable enough foundation for the revision of the prior habits, is the cessation of certain apologies, the ending of the ongoing, habitual performance of contrition for aspects of the self that the comfortable life had trained the person to present as requiring apology. The apologies being described are not apologies for genuine wrongs. Those are not what needs to stop. They are the apologies that were never really apologies, the hedging that preceded the expression of a genuine opinion. the minimizing that attended the taking of genuinely needed space, the automatic qualification of any claim to the person's own experience or the person's own needs as things that required the prior acknowledgement that other people's experiences and needs were more legitimate. These apologies had accumulated in the comfortable life as social habits, the habits of the person who had learned, through the ordinary processes of social formation, that the management of other people's comfort was a higher priority than the honest expression of the self. The loss disrupted these habits partly by disrupting the social contexts in which they operated and partly by providing the person with a recalibration of what actually mattered that made the maintenance of the apologetic performance seem, from the new vantage, like a waste of the limited resource of the day. People who have survived the genuine catastrophe tend to develop an impatience with the performances of the prior comfortable life that is, in its effect, liberating. The performance was costing something, the loss made the cost visible, and the rebuilt life declined to keep paying it. They stopped apologizing for being themselves. The relief was immediate. The self-recrimination for not having stopped sooner was also immediate. Both were appropriate responses. 20 Lessons at 20, what the rebuilding most requires. We have arrived at the 20th lesson in our journey through the testimony of the people who lost everything and started over, and the portrait of what the rebuilding most requires, the qualities and the understandings and the practical orientations that the people who rebuilt most consistently identify as having been most necessary, has by now taken on enough detail and enough coherence to be genuinely useful. What the rebuilding most requires, across all the different forms the loss took and all the different circumstances in which the starting over was required, is a specific combination of qualities that the comfortable life tends not to develop in the same form or to the same degree. The willingness to remain in the uncertainty long enough for the genuine next thing to become visible, rather than rushing to reconstruct the prior thing or to accept the nearest available substitute. The honesty to tell the true account to the people who can receive it, rather than maintaining the managed version that the shame of the loss tends to produce, and the patience to allow the rebuilding to take the time it actually requires, rather than the time the surrounding culture and the person's own desire to be done with the difficulty suggests it should take. In these first 20 lessons, we have heard the beginning of this account, the solid bottom, the identity stripped of its external markers, the friends who stayed and those who did not, the nonlinear path, the sufficiency of less, the paradox of the terrified and capable simultaneously, the narrative that made the agency visible, the true timeline, the secondary losses, the unexpected kindness, the discovered resilience, the first almost normal day, the things released, the shame confronted. The dead end that was a door, the survivable worst case, the body's steadiness, and the apologies that stopped. The rubble is real. The foundation is visible. The building has begun. This is explored during Sleeping 21, the moment they stopped waiting to be rescued. There is a turning point in the experience of major loss that the people who rebuilt consistently identify as the moment the rebuilding genuinely began, not the moment the loss occurred, not the moment the practical decisions about what to do next were first forced upon them, but the interior moment in which the passive orientation toward the situation, the orientation of the person waiting for someone or something to arrive and reverse the direction of events, gave way to the active orientation of the person who understood, in whatever form that understanding arrived, that no rescue was coming and that the next chapter of the life would be written by the person living it or would not be written at all. The waiting is not irrational in its origins. The person in the conditions of the major loss has, in many cases, recently experienced the loss of something that was supposed to provide security, the marriage, the financial position, the career, and the reasonable response to the loss of security is to look for a replacement security, another person, another institution, another arrangement that will restore the feeling of being held by something larger than the self. The waiting is the looking for the replacement holding. It is understandable. It is also, in the testimony of people who rebuilt, ultimately inadequate, not because rescue never comes, but because the orientation of waiting for it tends to produce a passivity in relation to the available options that makes the options harder to see and harder to act on when they become visible. The moment the waiting stopped was described in many different ways across the different testimonies, but its essential character was consistent. The decision, not always made consciously, sometimes made gradually rather than all at once, to act from the position that the next move was theirs to make. Not because rescue was impossible or because help was unavailable, but because the waiting for rescue was consuming the time and the attention that the making of the next move required. They stopped waiting. The rebuilding began. The two events were the same event. 22. What asking for help actually looked like. The cultural ideal of the self-made person, the person who navigated the conditions of the major loss through the resources of their own character and their own intelligence and their own will, without the requirement of assistance from anyone else, is one of the most pervasive and one of the most damaging myths in the testimony of people who have rebuilt after losing everything. Damaging because its influence tends to delay the asking for help that the conditions genuinely require and to produce. In the period before the asking, a suffering that the asking would have shortened. The people who rebuilt did not rebuild alone. This is one of the most consistent findings in the entire testimony. The rebuilt life was constructed with help, practical help, financial help, emotional help, the help of the person who knew someone, the help of the professional whose knowledge provided what the person's own knowledge did not cover, the help of the friend who was willing to hear the same account of the difficulty more times than the friend's own patience would have suggested was reasonable. The asking for this help was not easy. The people who asked described the asking as having been among the harder things the loss required, harder, in many cases, than any of the practical tasks of the rebuilding, because the asking required the acknowledgement of the need, and the acknowledgement of the need required the revision of the self-image that the comfortable life had constructed around the not needing. The wisdom this offers is not abstract. It is practical and direct. Identify the person whose help would most change the current position and ask them. Not the performance of asking, not the hedged, minimized, apologetic request that already contains its own retraction, but the honest asking in which the nature of the need is clearly stated and the request is made without the preemptive apology that makes the receiving of the help awkward for the person being asked to give it. The help was available. The asking was the only thing required to access it. The asking was the hardest part. It was also, in the experience of everyone who did it, worth it. 23. The new people who arrived. Among the changes that the rebuilt life produces, changes that the person in the middle of the loss cannot always anticipate because the loss has not yet created the conditions that the changes require. One of the most consistently described and the most personally significant is the arrival of people who would not have been in the prior life. Not replacements for the people who were lost, not the same relationships in different bodies, but genuinely new people whose presence in the rebuilt life was made possible by the loss in ways that the loss could not have been predicted to produce. The mechanism is not mysterious. The loss changes the person, and the changed person moves through the world differently, occupies different spaces, pursues different things, presents a different version of themselves to the people they encounter. The person rebuilt by the experience of major loss is not the same person who entered the experience, and the people who are drawn to the rebuilt person are, in some cases, people who would not have been drawn to the prior version, people who value or who share. The qualities that the loss developed, the honesty that the loss made necessary, the directness that the loss produced by removing the social performances that the comfortable life had been maintaining, the specific quality of the person who has been tested and who has survived the testing and who carries that surviving in the way they inhabit the world. The people who arrived in the rebuilt life are not always immediately recognizable as replacements for what was lost, because they are not replacements. They are genuinely different people, suited to the genuinely different person the rebuilding produced. The people who rebuilt describe them with a consistent warmth, the warmth of genuine surprise, of the people who arrived not despite the loss, but partly because of it, who would not have been findable from the prior position, and whose presence in the rebuilt life was one of the clearest pieces of evidence that the rebuilt life was not a diminished version of the prior one, but something with its own genuine value. 24. The small win and why it mattered. The role of the small win in the early period of the rebuilding, the modest achievement, the minor task completed, the single day navigated without the catastrophe that the anxiety of the early rebuilding consistently predicted, is described in the testimony of people who rebuilt as more important to the sustainability of the rebuilding effort than its smallness might suggest. The small win does not resolve the loss. It does not address the large questions. It does not provide the evidence that the rebuilt life will ultimately succeed. What it provides is something more immediately necessary: the evidence that movement is possible, that the person is capable of action in the conditions that the loss created, and that the day can contain something that was done rather than only things that were endured. The psychological research on recovery from adversity is consistent with what the testimony describes. The early rebuilding period is the period in which the person's sense of efficacy, their belief in their own capacity to produce desired outcomes through their own actions, is most depleted, and the restoration of that sense of efficacy is one of the most important tasks of the early recovery. The small win restores it incrementally through the accumulation of the evidence that the person can do things and that the things they do produce results. The evidence is modest. Its modesty is not the point. The point is the accumulation, the first small win followed by the second, followed by the third, each one adding a thin layer of demonstrated competence to the foundation of the rebuilt confidence. The wisdom the people who rebuilt offer about the small win is the wisdom of the deliberate pursuit of it. In the early period of the rebuilding, when the large problems are genuinely large and the capacity to address them directly is genuinely limited, the identification and the pursuit of the small, addressable, completable task is not a distraction from the real work. It is the real work. The real work, in the early period, is the restoration of the belief that work produces results. The small win is how that belief is restored. 25. What they discovered about their own creativity. The loss of the prior life, the prior career, the prior identity, the prior set of obligations and constraints and roles that had organized the daily existence, removed, alongside the things that were genuinely missed, the structures that had been preventing certain other things from becoming visible or possible. Among the most consistently and the most gratefully described of these unexpected gifts is the discovery of a creative capacity that the prior life had been suppressing, not through any malicious intent, but through the ordinary accumulation of the demands of the established life, which had left no room and no time and no permission for the things that the person, in the conditions of the building and maintaining of that life, had not been doing. The person who had been running the business and the household and the marriage simultaneously, whose every hour was allocated to the maintenance of the prior life's complexity, discovered in the loss of that life the sudden availability of unallocated time, time that the grief initially filled, but that the recovery gradually cleared, and that sat in the rebuilt schedule as a space whose contents were genuinely available to be chosen rather than prescribed by the prior structure. Many of the people who rebuilt filled this space, eventually, with the creative work they had been deferring for years. The writing, the painting, the music, the making of things with the hands that the prior life's demands had made feel like an indulgence. The discovery of the genuine pleasure of the creative work, its resistance to the clock, its specific satisfaction, its capacity to produce a quality of absorption that nothing in the prior life had quite provided, was one of the genuine surprises of the rebuilt life and one of its genuine enrichments. The wisdom is not that loss is necessary for creativity, or that the creative life requires the destruction of the prior life to become accessible. It is the observation that the prior life structures had been consuming something that the creative work requires: time, attention, permission, and that the loss of those structures made the consumption visible by ending it. The creative capacity was always there. The conditions that make it accessible were the conditions the rebuilding, unintentionally and at great cost, created. 26. The relationship between the lost life and the rebuilt one. The rebuilt life is not the lost life restored. This is one of the things that the people who rebuilt most consistently want the people who are in the middle of the losing to understand, because the desire to restore the lost life, to reconstruct, as faithfully as possible, the version of the existence that the loss ended, is one of the most natural responses to the loss and one of the most reliably inadequate frameworks for the rebuilding. The lost life cannot be reconstructed. The person who attempts to reconstruct it discovers, in the attempt, that the person doing the rebuilding is not the same person who built the original, and that the attempt to build the same thing with a different person produces something that resembles the original in its external features and that feels, from the inside, like a costume rather than a life. The relationship between the lost life and the rebuilt one is better understood not as restoration, but as inheritance. The rebuilt life inherits from the lost one the things that were genuinely valuable in it, the relationships, the knowledge, the skills, the parts of the identity that were genuinely the person's own rather than the person's performance, and leaves behind the things that were not genuinely the person's own, the accumulations of the comfortable life that the loss has now revealed as external to the actual self. What is rebuilt is not the lost life, but a life that is more genuinely the person's than the lost life was allowed to be by the incremental accretion of its years. This is not a comfortable understanding in the period of the loss, when what is most wanted is the return of what was, not the construction of something that may be better, but that is undeniably different. The comfort of this understanding arrives later, when the rebuilt life has had time to demonstrate its own genuine value, when the person living it has had time to inhabit it fully enough to know it from the inside. Then, looking back, the loss and the rebuilding are visible in a different light, not as the destruction of the good thing and its inferior replacement, but as the clearing of the space in which the genuine thing could finally be built. 27. What they learned about the nature of failure. The understanding of failure that the experience of major loss produces, the understanding that is available only to the person who has actually failed in ways that were visible and consequential, who has lived through the judgment of the failure and the consequences of the judgment and the duration of the living with the consequences, is one of the most genuinely valuable and the most consistently transformative pieces of knowledge that the experience deposits. Valuable because it replaces the imagined failure with the actual one, and the actual one turns out, in almost every case, to be considerably less final and considerably more instructive than the imagined version had suggested. The culture's relationship to failure is organized primarily around avoidance. The systems of education and professional development and social aspiration are designed, in large part, to prevent failure rather than to provide the person with the knowledge and the framework required to navigate it when it occurs. This design produces a specific and significant vulnerability. The person who has been trained to avoid failure has not been trained to survive it, and when the failure occurs, as it eventually does, in some form, in most lives, the person encounters it without the resources that the experience of surviving prior failures would have provided. The first major failure is, for many people, the most disorienting precisely because nothing in the prior training has prepared them for the experience of failing and continuing. The people who rebuilt after major failure describe the experience of the failure itself, the actual living through of it, as distinct from the anticipation of it, as considerably less definitive than the prior fear of failure had suggested. The failure was real, the judgment was real, the consequences were real, and the person was still there, still capable, still in possession of the knowledge and the relationships and the character that the failure did not and could not remove. The failure was a chapter, not a verdict. The knowledge of this, the direct, embodied knowledge of it, is one of the things that the rebuilt life carries as a genuine advantage over the life that was never tested. 28. The thing they rebuilt that they never expected. Among the things that the people who rebuilt after major loss describe as among the most significant gains of the rebuilding process, the things they built in the rebuilt life that were not present in the prior life and whose presence they did not anticipate when the rebuilding began, is the thing they had given up on before the loss made the giving up on visible. The creative project that had been deferred so long it had effectively been abandoned. The relationship with a family member that the prior life's demands had allowed to deteriorate past what had seemed like the point of repair. The quality of daily presence with the people who were closest that the prior life's complexity had consistently prevented. The rebuilding, because it begins from a cleared space, allows for the possibility of rebuilding things that the prior life structure had made inaccessible. The person who discovers, in the cleared space of the early rebuilding, that a thing they had effectively relinquished is actually still available to be pursued, that the creative work is still possible, that the relationship can still be repaired, that the quality of daily presence they had been deferring is actually available now, describes the discovery with the particular quality of gratitude that belongs to the found thing rather than the acquired thing. The gratitude of the person who recognizes something that was always theirs and that the circumstances had temporarily placed beyond reach. This is not available to everyone who goes through major loss, and the people who describe it do not offer it as a guarantee. They offer it as a possibility, the possibility that the cleared space of the rebuilding contains, among the difficulties that are genuinely present, the genuine opportunity to build something that the prior structure had been preventing, and that the person who looks for this possibility in the midst of the rebuilding may find it in a form they did not anticipate and would not have found in any other way. 29. The wisdom of the incomplete recovery. The recovery from major loss is, in the testimony of the people who have lived through it most honestly, never entirely complete. This is not a counsel of despair. It is the honest account of what the recovery actually is, not the return to the prior state, not the elimination of the loss from the interior life, not the achievement of a condition in which the loss is so thoroughly processed that it ceases to be a feature of the person's experience of the world. The recovery is the integration of the loss into the ongoing life, the finding of a way to carry what the loss left behind without being entirely defined by it, to be the person the loss made without being only that person. The incomplete recovery is not a failure of recovery. It is the nature of recovery from genuine loss, which is not the restoration of the prior condition, but the development of a new condition that includes the loss as one of its elements rather than excluding it. The person who has lost a child, or a marriage of decades, or a life built over years, does not recover from that loss in the sense of arriving at a condition where the loss is no longer present in the interior. They recover in the sense of arriving at a condition where the loss is present alongside other things, alongside the rebuilt life, alongside the new people and the new work and the new understanding of themselves that the rebuilding produced, and where the presence of the loss is no longer the only or the primary feature of the experience of being alive. The wisdom this understanding offers to the person in the middle of the recovery is the wisdom of the realistic destination, not the completion that the cultural narrative of the healed person implies, but the integration that is actually available and actually sufficient. The loss becomes part of who they are. The person who is made partly by the loss is not a lesser person than the person who was not. They are a different person, more complex, more honest about the full range of what the world contains, and in possession of a depth that the comfortable life, which did not require the testing, did not produce. 30 Lessons at 30, the shape of the rebuilt life. We have arrived at the 30th lesson, and the portrait of what the rebuilt life actually requires and what it actually produces, drawn from the testimony of the people who lost everything and did the work of the starting over, has by now accumulated enough detail and enough honesty to be genuinely useful. In the last 10 lessons, we followed the people who lost everything through the turn from waiting to acting, through the honest asking for help that the cultural myth of the self-made person made difficult, through the arrival of the new people and the discovery of the small win and the creative capacity that the prior life had been covering. We watched them understand the relationship between the lost life and the rebuilt one, not restoration, but inheritance. We heard them describe what failure actually was when it was no longer hypothetical. We found the thing they rebuilt that they had given up on. And we heard the honest account of the incomplete recovery, which is the only recovery that actually exists. What emerges from these 30 lessons is the shape of a rebuilt life, smaller in some dimensions, larger in others, stripped of certain performances and accumulated costs, more genuinely the person's own than the prior life was allowed to be by the incremental momentum of its years. It is not the life that was planned. It is not the life that was lost. It is the life that the loss made possible, and that the person, in the clearing of the rubble and the carrying of the foundation and the patient, imperfect, determined work of the starting over, actually built. In the 70 lessons that remain, we go deeper into what the building produces. This is explored during Sleeping 31. Vulnerability was strength in disguise. The prior life had, in most cases, organized itself around the management of vulnerability, around the maintenance of the appearances of competence and stability, and having it together that the social world rewards and that the internal pressure of the person who values those appearances consistently demands. The management was not dishonest in any simple sense. The competence was often real, the stability was often genuine, and the appearance of having it together was, in the ordinary conditions of the ordinary life, not entirely a performance. But it was also, in a way that the comfortable life did not require the person to examine, a cost, the cost of the energy that the management of the appearances consumed, the cost of the distance between the presented self and the interior one that the management produced, and the cost of the relationships that could not develop beyond a certain depth, because the vulnerability required for depth was not available to be offered. The loss stripped the management away, not gradually, not voluntarily, but completely and at a stroke. The situation was now too large and too visible for the management to cover, and the person found themselves, for the first time in the adult life, genuinely unable to appear fine when they were not fine. This inability, experienced initially as a failure, as the collapse of the composure that had been so carefully maintained, turned out to produce something unexpected: connection. The honest account of the difficulty, offered not as a performance, but as the plain truth of the situation, produced in the people who received it a response that the managed version had never produced. The vulnerability was met with recognition. The recognition produced closeness. The closeness was the beginning of the kind of relationships that the managed life had been, without knowing it, preventing. The wisdom is not that vulnerability should be performed or manufactured or directed at every available audience. It is the observation that the genuine expression of genuine difficulty in the conditions of genuine trust produces a quality of human connection that the managed presentation of the functional self consistently forecloses. The loss removed the management. What the management had been preventing was, it turned out, exactly what the recovery most needed. 32. What money actually was. The financial dimension of major loss, the loss of the house, the business, the savings, the standard of living, produces in the people who have been through it a recalibration of the understanding of money that is, in its mature form, one of the most practically useful pieces of knowledge available from the testimony. It is not the abstract philosophical wisdom that money is not happiness, which is available to anyone and which most people believe in principle while organizing their practical lives around the assumption that more would be better. It is the embodied, lived, directly experienced wisdom of the person who had the money and lost it and discovered, in the losing, the actual relationship between the financial position and the quality of the daily experience of being alive. The relationship is real but bounded. Below a certain threshold, the threshold at which the basic material requirements of a decent life are not reliably met. The absence of money is a genuine and significant source of suffering that no amount of philosophical equanimity can adequately compensate for. The person who is genuinely unable to pay for housing or food or medical care is experiencing a deprivation whose reality, the comfortable philosophical position about the irrelevance of money, cannot honestly reach. The people who lost everything consistently acknowledge this dimension of the financial loss and do not minimize it. Above that threshold, however, and the threshold is lower than the prior standard of living tended to place it, the correlation between the financial position and the quality of the daily experience becomes much weaker and eventually negligible. The people who rebuilt from a significantly reduced financial position and who describe the rebuilt life with genuine satisfaction are describing the direct experience of the sufficiency of the rebuilt position, which was materially less than the prior position and which, in the experience of living in it, was enough. The prior position had been carrying costs, in complexity, in obligation, in the maintenance of the standard of living, that the reduced position did not carry. The reduction was, in some cases, experienced as a genuine relief. The money was real. What it had been purchasing was, in some proportion, the management of its own excess. 33. What the children saw. Among the many dimensions of the experience of major loss that the testimony most carefully and most honestly addresses, none is handled with more care or more guilt and more genuine uncertainty than the dimension of the children. The children who were present in the household during the period of the loss, who watched the adults they depended on navigating the conditions of the catastrophe, and who absorbed from the watching an account of the adult world and the adult capacity for difficulty that was not the account the parents had intended to provide, and that was also, in ways that the testimony consistently returns to, with a complicated mixture of regret and unexpected gratitude, not entirely without value. The regret is real, and the parents who describe it do not minimize it. The children saw things they should not have had to see. They absorbed anxieties that belonged to the adults and that the adults were not always sufficiently resourced to protect them from. They were present in the household during the period when the household was most frightened and most uncertain, and the presence in a frightened household leaves marks that do not disappear when the fear resolves. The parents who describe this dimension of the loss carry the guilt of the inadequacy with a weight that the subsequent recovery of the household does not entirely lift. And yet, alongside the guilt, in the same breath and with the same honesty, the parents who rebuilt describe what the children also absorbed: the watching of a person navigate a genuine catastrophe without being destroyed by it, the direct observation of the adult capacity for resilience, the evidence that the loss of the prior things did not end the family but changed it, and that the family continued, in its changed form, as a genuine and functioning unit. The children who watch the adults lose everything and start over received, alongside the anxiety and the insecurity, the testimony of the survivable catastrophe demonstrated not in words, but in the daily evidence of the parent getting up and continuing. This too was absorbed. The parents did not intend to teach it this way. They taught it this way anyway. 34. The day they laughed again. The return of genuine laughter, not the social performance of laughter, not the polite response to the light moment offered by the people around them who were working hard to provide some relief from the weight, but the involuntary, unmanaged, genuinely felt laughter that arrives when something is actually funny and the person experiencing it is present enough in the moment to receive it, is described in the testimony of people who rebuilt as one of the most significant and the most emotionally complicated milestones of the recovery period. It is significant because it is the evidence, arriving without announcement and without the prior intention to provide it, that the interior life has thought enough to permit something other than the grief and the practicality of the rebuilding. The genuine laugh is not something that can be produced by will in the conditions of the genuine loss. It requires a condition of the interior that is not available in the depths of the crisis, and that returns only as the recovery accumulates to the point where the present moment can, briefly and without guilt, be genuinely present in itself rather than always in the shadow of the loss. The day the laugh arrived was the day the person could feel the difference between that day and the days that had preceded it. It is complicated because the laugh, when it arrived, often arrived alongside a guilt that the laugh seemed to require addressing. The guilt of the person who laughed while the loss was still real, who permitted a moment of genuine lightness in the conditions where the gravity of the situation would seem to demand that the lightness be refused. The people who rebuilt worked through this guilt not by arguing against it, but by recognizing that the laugh was not a betrayal of the loss, but the first evidence of the resilience that the rebuilding required, the first evidence that the person was still capable of receiving the ordinary pleasures of the ordinary world, and that the receiving of them was not a diminishment of the loss, but the beginning of the capacity to carry the loss without being entirely consumed by it. 35. What the loss clarified about values. The experience of major loss functions, among its other functions, as a clarification engine. It removes, by force and without asking permission, the layers of accumulated obligation and social performance and habitual commitment that the comfortable life had deposited around the actual values of the person living it, and it leaves standing, with a visibility that the prior accumulation had been preventing, the things that actually mattered, the relationships, the work, the daily practices, and the ways of engaging with the world that remained important after everything else had been stripped away. The clarification is not pleasant. The person did not ask for the clarification, and the method of its production, the wholesale removal of the prior life structure, was not the method the person would have chosen if the clarification had been offered as an option rather than imposed as a consequence. But the clarity, when it arrives, is real and durable in a way that the prior life's incremental adjustments toward greater self-knowledge had not produced. The person who has had everything removed and who has then chosen, from the cleared space, what to rebuild and in what order and for what purpose, is a person who has done the most direct form of values clarification available. The clarification that is performed not through reflection, but through the necessity of choosing what matters when the resources for everything are not available. The consistent finding in the testimony is that what was rebuilt first, what was chosen before the resources for anything beyond the most essential had been restored, was not what the prior life had been organized to protect and expand. It was something quieter and more personal, the relationship with the child who needed the time, the creative practice that had been deferred, the friendship that had been neglected in the service of the prior life's demands. The loss had clarified what was worth the limited resource of the rebuilding period. The rebuilt life, organized around the clarified values, tended to feel more genuinely the person's own than the prior life had allowed itself to be. 36. The new relationship with risk. The relationship with risk that the person who has lost everything carries into the rebuilt life is different from the relationship they carried through the prior one, different in a way that is not always immediately obvious, and that reveals itself gradually in the pattern of decisions the rebuilt person makes in circumstances that the prior person would have found more frightening. The difference is not the elimination of caution. The people who rebuilt after major loss are not, as a rule, reckless in the rebuilt life, and the experience of the loss has not produced in them an indifference to the possibility of losing again. The difference is in the calculation of the risk, which is now performed with a specific and direct knowledge of the worst-case outcome that the prior calculation lacked. The prior calculation of the risk, the calculation performed by the person who had not yet experienced the major loss, was a calculation made in the shadow of the imagined worst case, whose dimensions were shaped by the imagination rather than by the experience, and whose imagined dimensions were, in most cases, more deterring than the actual dimensions of the worst case proved to be. The person who lost everything and survived the losing has replaced the imagined worst case with the actual one, and the actual one, for all its genuine difficulty, has a known size and a known duration and a known survivability. The risk of the next attempt is not risk-free, but the downside of the next failure is the known downside rather than the imagined one, and the known downside, in the experience of the people who rebuilt, was survivable before and is survivable again. This recalibrated relationship with risk tends to produce, in the rebuilt life, a willingness to attempt things that the prior life's fear of the imagined worst case had prevented, a willingness that is not recklessness, but the appropriate confidence of the person who has been to the bottom and come back, and who therefore knows, from direct experience, that the bottom is solid. They try things they would not have tried before. Some of those things work. The ones that do not work are survived with an equanimity that the person who has never been to the bottom cannot quite access by the same means. 37. What they found when they stopped performing. The comfortable life had required, in most cases, a level of performance, the performance of the competent professional, the performance of the successful adult, the performance of the person who had it together and who was doing fine, that the loss made untenable and whose untenability turned out to be, among the losses, many gifts to the person it forced out of the performance, one of the more valuable. The performance had been so long maintained and so thoroughly integrated into the daily presentation of the self that the person had, in some cases, partially lost track of the difference between the performance and the actual interior. The loss drew the distinction sharply by making the performance impossible to maintain, and the cessation of the performance revealed, in the cleared space, the actual person who had been maintaining it. What the actual person turned out to be was not worse than the performed version. In most cases, it was more interesting, more genuinely curious, more honestly uncertain about the right answers to the questions the performance had been answering with performed confidence, more capable of genuine engagement with the people around them, because the distance required for the management of the performance had been removed. The person who had performed competence was replaced by the person who was competent at some things and genuinely learning at others, and the genuinely learning person was more present in the conversations about the learning than the performed competence had been present in the conversations it had been performing for. The wisdom this dimension of the experience offers is not the counsel to eliminate all performance from the social life. Some performance is appropriate. Some management of the presented self serves legitimate functions, and the wholesale abandonment of the social presentation is not what the testimony is recommending. It is the more careful counsel to periodically examine the distance between the presented self and the interior one, and to reduce that distance in the relationships where the reduction is possible and where the genuine connection that the reduction makes available is worth the vulnerability that the reduction requires. 38. The role of solitude in the rebuilding. The period of the rebuilding, for many of the people who went through it, involved a degree of solitude that the prior life had not produced, not the solitude of the chosen retreat, but the solitude of the reduced social world, the contracted circumstances, the quieter days in which the prior life's social complexity was absent, and the person found themselves, perhaps for the first time in the adult life, genuinely alone with themselves for extended periods. This solitude was experienced initially as one of the losses, the loss of the prior social world, of the noise and the distraction, and the sense of being embedded in a community of people whose various demands had organized the days, and later, in many cases, as one of the recovery's unexpected contributions. The solitude produced, in the conditions of the recovery, an encounter with the self that the prior life's demands had been preventing. The person who had been busy, who had filled the available hours with the management of the prior life's complexity, was now in possession of hours that were not filled, and the unfilled hours were initially deeply uncomfortable in the way that genuine solitude is always uncomfortable for the person who has not developed a relationship with their own interior. The discomfort is the discomfort of the person who is suddenly in the company of the only person they have been with for their entire life, and who does not, yet, know that person particularly well. The people who rebuilt describe the development of the relationship with the interior self that the solitude forced as one of the most practically significant changes of the recovery period. The person who knows their own interior, who has spent time in it, who has developed the capacity to be in it without the mediation of the constant stimulation that the prior life provided, is a person with an interior resource that the busy life does not develop. They found in the solitude the company of someone worth knowing. The someone was themselves. 39. The gratitude that arrived in the ruins. Among the emotional experiences that the people who lost everything most consistently describe as having surprised them. Surprised not in the sense of being pleasant, since the conditions of the surprise were not pleasant, but in the sense of arriving in a form that the prior understanding of the conditions did not predict, is a quality of gratitude that emerged in the period of the loss from sources so modest that the comfortable life would not have produced anything resembling gratitude in relation to them. The gratitude was not the comfortable life's gratitude for the good things, the house, the career, the social position, that the comfortable life occasionally acknowledged as things to be grateful for. It was the gratitude of the person who had lost those things and who found, in the conditions of their absence, a quality of awareness of the small remaining goods, that the presence of the large goods had been overwhelming. The cup of warm coffee in the morning. The sound of the rain without the anxiety of what the rain might damage, because the things the rain might damage were gone. The walk in the morning without the pressure of the day that the prior life's complexity would have assembled around it. These small things, available in the conditions of the loss as they had been available throughout the prior life, were visible in a way that the prior life had not required them to be. The people who rebuilt describe this form of gratitude, the gratitude of the reduced circumstances. The gratitude that the loss had cleared the ground for as one of the unexpected gifts of the experience. Not a gift they would have purchased at the price it cost, but a gift nevertheless, genuinely received, genuinely changing the quality of the daily experience of the rebuilt life by installing in it a baseline appreciation for the ordinary goods of the ordinary day that the prior life's abundance had made invisible. 40 Lessons at 40, What the Rebuilding Made. We have arrived at the 40th lesson, and the portrait of the person that the rebuilding process produces, the person who emerged from the loss and the starting over as something genuinely different from the person who entered it, has by now taken on enough detail and enough depth to be seen in something close to its full form. In the last 10 lessons, we watched the performance fall away and found the actual person underneath it. We followed the recalibrated relationship with risk into the rebuilt life and watched it produce a willingness that the prior life's fear of the imagined worst case had been preventing. We received the gratitude that arrived in the ruins, the solitude that turned out to be an encounter with someone worth knowing, the laughter that returned as the first evidence of the thawed interior, the clarified values that organized the rebuilt life around what actually mattered rather than what the prior momentum had been building toward. We heard what the children absorbed from watching the adults navigate the catastrophe, and we heard about the financial recalibration and the vulnerability that turned out to be connection, and the discovery of the creative capacity that the prior life's demands had been suppressing. What the rebuilding made, across all these different lessons and all these different lives, is a person who knows things that the comfortable life does not teach. The survivability of the worst case, the sufficiency of less, the clarity that the loss forced about what actually matters, the connection that the vulnerability made possible, the resilience that the surviving installed as a feature of the self rather than as an aspiration. The 40 lessons assembled here are the beginning of that knowledge. The 60 that remain go deeper into what the rebuilt life, lived from its new foundation, most reliably produces. This is explored during sleeping. 41. What they learned about home after losing it. The understanding of home that the experience of losing the physical home, the house, the apartment, the dwelling that had been the container of the daily life, produces in the person who goes through it is one of the most consistently described and the most personally significant dimensions of the testimony. Significant not primarily because of what it says about housing, but because of what it reveals about what home actually was and had always been, which turned out to be considerably less about the physical container than the prior attachment to it had suggested. The loss of the house produced, initially, a grief that was organized around the physical place. The rooms, the light at particular times of day in particular windows, the garden, the neighborhood, the accumulation of associations that years of daily life in a place deposits in the person who lived in it. This grief was real, and the people who experienced it do not minimize it. But the grief for the physical place was also, in the experience of the rebuilding, separable from the grief for the actual home, and the actual home, it turned out, was not the physical container, but the people and the rhythms and the quality of the life that the container had been housing. When the people and the rhythms were reconstituted in a different container, the feeling of home reconstituted itself in ways that surprised the people who had assumed the home was inseparable from the place. This discovery that home follows the people rather than the walls, that the quality of the feeling of home is portable in a way that the prior attachment to the physical place had obscured, is one of the most genuinely useful pieces of knowledge that the loss of the house deposits in the person who eventually rebuilds. They know, from the direct experience of having had the house and lost it, and found the home again in a different place, that the home is not the house. The house was where the home lived. The home lived in something more durable than walls. This knowledge, carried into the rebuilt life, changes the relationship to the next house, which is understood as a container, not a foundation, and which can therefore be inhabited with a quality of presence that the person who confuses the two cannot quite achieve. 42. The rebuilding of trust. The loss of the prior life, particularly the loss that involved a betrayal, a deception, a broken agreement, the specific failure of a person or an institution that was trusted and whose trustworthiness turned out to be conditional, tends to leave in the person who experienced it a disruption of the general capacity for trust that extends beyond the person or institution whose specific failure occasioned it. The person who was betrayed by the partner they trusted finds it difficult to trust the next partner with the same openness. The person whose business was ruined by the partner who misrepresented their position finds the next potential collaborator approached with a wariness that the collaboration requires dismantling before it can proceed. The disruption is not irrational. It is the nervous system's reasonable response to the evidence that trust was extended and the extension was not honored. The rebuilding of trust, the gradual, incremental restoration of the capacity to extend trust again, to enter new relationships with the openness that genuine relationship requires without the protection of the wariness that the prior betrayal installed, is one of the longest and the most personally demanding dimensions of the recovery, and one that the testimony addresses with the honesty of people who did not find it easy and who do not want to suggest that it should be. The rebuilding of trust is not the elimination of discernment. The people who rebuilt describe not the restoration of the prior undiscriminating openness, but the development of a more calibrated trust, the trust that is extended to the person who has earned it through the consistent evidence of their trustworthiness, rather than the trust that is extended by default and withdrawn when the evidence suggests it should be withdrawn. This calibrated trust, the trust that is extended deliberately rather than automatically, tends to produce, in the rebuilt life, a smaller number of relationships of greater depth than the prior life had contained. The prior life's broad social trust had produced a broad social world in which the depth of the connections was limited by the number of them. The rebuilt trust, extended to fewer people with more discernment, tended to produce a smaller world whose connections were more reliable and whose reliability was more deeply felt. 43. The role of anger in the recovery. The anger that accompanies major loss, particularly the major loss that arrived not as a purely circumstantial catastrophe, but as the consequence of someone else's choice, someone else's deception, someone else's negligence or cruelty, is one of the most honestly and the most carefully addressed emotions in the testimony of people who rebuilt. Carefully addressed because the people who rebuilt are acutely aware of both the legitimacy of the anger and the cost of maintaining it beyond the point at which it serves a productive function. The legitimacy of the anger is the first thing the testimony establishes and the thing the people who rebuilt are least willing to compromise. The anger was appropriate. What happened was wrong, and the anger was the appropriate response to the wrong, and the cultural pressure on the person who has been genuinely wronged to move past the anger more quickly than the processing of the anger allows is itself a secondary wrong. The imposition of the surrounding culture's discomfort with the anger onto the person whose anger the culture did not earn the right to manage. The anger was not the problem. The timing of the anger, extending past the point at which it was serving any productive function, was the part that required attention. The productive anger, the anger that drove the practical actions required to address the wrong, that provided the energy for the confrontations and the decisions and the separations that the wrong made necessary, was one of the recovery's most useful resources in the early period. The anger that continued past the productive period, that became the primary relationship maintained with the person who caused the loss, that organized the interior life around the maintaining of the grievance rather than the building of the rebuilt life, was the anger that the people who rebuilt eventually, at considerable cost and through considerable effort, worked to release. The release was not the forgiveness of the wrong. It was the decision to stop paying the cost of maintaining the grievance at the expense of the rebuilding. 44. What they discovered about their own needs. The period of the loss and the early rebuilding tends to produce, in the people who go through it, an encounter with their own needs that the prior life had been postponing. The discovery of what they actually required in relationships, in daily life, in the organization of their time and their energy, that the prior life's accumulated commitments and performed self-sufficiency had made it possible to defer indefinitely. The deferral was not always conscious. It is one of the ordinary features of the adult life, organized around the management of other people's needs and the maintenance of the prior life's various obligations, that one's own needs recede to the background of the daily experience, addressed when there is time left over and rarely having time left over. The loss removed the framework of obligations within which the deferral had been operating, and the removal of the framework produced a clarity about the needs that the framework had been obscuring. The person who had been running the household and managing the career and maintaining the social obligations of the prior life found themselves, in the reduced circumstances of the early rebuilding, with fewer obligations and therefore with less to defer the needs behind. The needs became visible. Some of them were surprising. Some of them were things the person had not known they needed because the prior life had provided their absence rather than their presence, and the absence had been so habitual that it had ceased to register as an absence. The wisdom this dimension of the experience offers is practical and direct. The needs that the prior life was deferring do not disappear in the deferral. They accumulate. The person who rebuilt from the cleared space of the major loss and who built toward the needs rather than around them, who used the clarity of the reduced circumstances to organize the rebuilt life around what was actually required, describes a quality of the rebuilt daily life that the prior life, organized around the management of everything else, had not produced. The needs were the map. The loss made the map readable. 45. The moment the rebuilding felt real. The transition from the rebuilding as an effortful, uncertain, consciously maintained project to the rebuilt life as a genuinely inhabited reality. The moment at which the person stopped experiencing the rebuilt life as the rebuilding and started experiencing it as simply the life, is described in the testimony as one of the most significant and the most quietly arrived at milestones of the entire recovery. It does not arrive with announcement. It does not present itself as the milestone the person has been working toward. It is recognized usually in retrospect. The person looks back at the recent period and notices that the quality of the daily experience has changed without their having been fully aware of the changing, that the rebuilt life has, at some point in the recent past, stopped feeling like a provisional arrangement and started feeling like the actual arrangement. The experience is described with a warmth that the difficult period of the rebuilding makes entirely comprehensible. The relief of the person who has been living in the construction and who finds themselves, one day, simply living in the house. The house is not the house they lost. It does not have all the features of the lost house. But it is genuinely theirs, genuinely habitable, genuinely capable of providing the quality of daily shelter that the house is for, and the inhabiting of it, with the full presence of the person who has rebuilt rather than the partial presence of the person who is building, is one of the most genuine satisfactions available to the human being who has been through the experience of the major loss and the patient work of the starting over. The wisdom the people who rebuilt offer about this milestone is the wisdom of trust in the process. The milestone is not produced by a specific decision or a specific event. It is the product of the accumulation of the ordinary days of the ordinary rebuilt life, lived with sufficient presence and sufficient commitment to the actual daily existence of the rebuilt circumstances, that the rebuilt circumstances eventually become, without the person's fully noticing, the circumstances of the actual life rather than the circumstances of the rebuilding. It happens. It takes the time it takes. It is worth the waiting. 46. What the loss taught them about control. Among the understandings that major loss deposits in the person who passes through it, the understanding of control, of what is and is not actually within the person's power to determine, and of the relationship between the attempt to control the uncontrollable and the quality of the experience of the life that is being lived, is one of the most practically consequential and the most consistently transformative. The prior life had, in most cases, been organized around a relationship with control that the major loss revealed as substantially illusory. The assumption that the right precautions, the right preparations, the right decisions, and the right maintenance of the right circumstances would protect the prior life from the catastrophe that eventually arrived anyway. The catastrophe was not always the product of the failure of the precautions. Sometimes it was, but often it was the product of forces that no precaution could have addressed: the illness, the economic collapse, the other person's choice, the accident of circumstance that could not have been predicted and could not have been prevented regardless of the quality of the preparation. The major loss in these cases was the demonstration that the control had been an assumption rather than a reality, a functional fiction that the comfortable life had allowed the person to maintain because the comfortable life had not yet produced the conditions that would have required the fiction to be tested. The testing produced, in the people who eventually rebuilt with a realistic understanding of what control actually is, a quality of lightness that the prior attempt to control the uncontrollable had been preventing. The attempt to control what cannot be controlled is not only ineffective, it is expensive, consuming the resource of the attention and the energy that the actual navigation of the actual circumstances requires. The person who rebuilt from the realistic understanding of control found the rebuilt life more navigable than the prior life had been, not because the rebuilt life was safer, but because the navigator had stopped trying to control the weather and had focused instead on the sailing. 47. The relationship with the person they were before. The person who emerges from the experience of major loss and the rebuilding that follows it is not the same person who entered the experience. This much is clear from the testimony and has been addressed in various dimensions across the preceding lessons. What the testimony also addresses, with a care and a thoughtfulness that reflects the genuine complexity of the subject, is the relationship between the changed person and the prior person. The person they were before the loss, whose prior existence is now accessible only through memory and the accounts of the people who knew them then, and whose relationship to the current self is one of the more philosophically interesting features of the rebuilt life. The prior person was not inferior to the rebuilt person. The rebuilt person tends not to idealize the prior self, which was the self of the prior life with all the prior life's limitations and performances and accumulated costs, but also does not dismiss it as the naive version that the experience corrected. The prior person was the person who built the prior life, who loved the people of the prior life, who had the experiences of the prior life in the form that they were available before the loss changed the form they were available in. The prior person is part of the inheritance of the rebuilt person, part of what was carried through the loss and built upon in the rebuilding. The relationship the rebuilt person develops with the prior self tends, over time, toward a quality of compassion that is different from the self-criticism that the loss can initially produce. A compassion for the person who built what they built with what they had, who loved with the capacity for love that they had developed, who could not have anticipated the loss in the form it arrived or prepared for it in the ways the loss revealed as necessary. The prior person did the best they could with what they had. The rebuilt person knows this from the inside of the same life and holds the prior version with the specific gentleness of the person who understands what they were working with. 48. What they wish someone had told them at the beginning. When the people who rebuilt after losing everything are asked what they most wish they had known at the beginning of the process, at the moment of the loss, or in the days immediately following it, the answers cluster around a small number of themes with a consistency that reflects the genuine universality of the experience and the genuine inadequacy of the cultural preparation for it. The answers are offered not as recriminations against the people who did not tell them, but as the direct counsel that the testimony most wants to provide to the person who is at the beginning of the same process now. The first thing they wish they had known is that the process would take longer than they thought, and that the longer duration was not evidence of failure. The timeline was always going to be longer than the cultural narrative suggested, and the knowledge of this, the genuine, accepted, non-reluctant knowledge, rather than the theoretical acknowledgement followed by the persistent expectation that the timeline would be shorter in their case, would have prevented a significant quantity of the suffering that was produced not by the loss itself, but by the expectation that the loss should have been processed more quickly than the processing actually required. The second thing they wish they had known is that the rebuilt life would be genuinely good, not as a consolation, not as a lesser version of what was lost, but genuinely good in its own right and in some ways better than what preceded it. This is not the thing that can be received at the beginning of the process, because the beginning of the process is not the place from which the rebuilt life is visible. But it is the thing they most want the person at the beginning to carry as a possibility, that the other side of the loss is real, that the rebuilt life is genuinely livable, and that the person currently in the rubble is already in possession of the most important resource the rebuilding will require, which is the person themselves standing in the rubble, which is solid ground. 49. The unexpected direction. Among the most consistent and the most personally significant findings of the rebuilt life, the findings that emerge from the actual living of the rebuilt life rather than from the planning and the anticipation of it, is the finding that the direction the rebuilding took was not the direction that was planned, and that the unplanned direction was, in most cases, more genuinely suited to the person who was doing the rebuilding than the planned direction would have been. The plan that was made in the early period of the rebuilding was the plan of the person who was still oriented toward the restoration of the prior life, toward the reconstruction of the career in the same field, the replacement of the relationship with a relationship that resembled the lost one, the return to the circumstances that were as close as possible to the circumstances that had been lost. This plan was natural and understandable, and in most cases, gradually revised by the reality of what actually became available and what actually felt genuinely right as the rebuilding proceeded. The actual direction of the rebuilding tended to be shaped by the combination of the clarity that the loss had produced about what actually mattered, the genuine discovery of the creative capacity and the genuine needs that the prior life had been covering, and the simple reality of what doors were open at the point when the person was ready to walk through a door. The combination produced directions that the planning could not have produced, because the planning was being done by the person before the loss, and the walking was being done by the person after it, and those were genuinely different people with genuinely different understandings of what was worth walking toward. The rebuilt life, in its actual form, tended to be surprising to the person who was living it, surprising in the direction of being more interesting, more genuinely theirs, and more aligned with what they had discovered about themselves in the conditions of the loss than the planned version would have been. The loss had clarified what was worth building. The clarification, applied to the actual work of the building, produced something that the planning, conducted before the clarification, could not have arrived at. 50 lessons at 50, the midpoint. We stand at the midpoint of our journey through the testimony of the people who lost everything and started over, and the full shape of what they most want to say, drawn from the accumulated evidence of 50 lessons, has by now achieved the coherence and the depth of something that deserves the name understanding. In the last 10 lessons, we followed them through the discovery of what home actually was after the physical home was gone, through the patient rebuilding of trust on more discerning foundations, through the anger that was legitimate and the anger that eventually needed releasing, through the encounter with the deferred needs and the moment the rebuilding stopped feeling like rebuilding and started feeling like the actual life. We received their understanding of control, the genuine one, earned through the failure of the prior fiction, and their relationship with the person they were before. We heard what they wished someone had told them at the beginning, and we followed the unexpected direction that the rebuilding took and found it more genuinely suited to the person who emerged than the planned direction would have been. What the 50 lessons assembled here have established is the essential structure of the rebuilt life. It is not the prior life restored. It is not the prior life improved. It is a different life, genuinely different, built from a cleared space by a person who was clarified by the clearing, organized around what the clearing revealed to actually matter, and inhabited with the quality of presence that the person who has survived the genuine worst case brings to the ordinary day. The 50 lessons ahead go deeper into what that life most genuinely offers and what the people who built it most want the people who are still building to know. The midpoint is solid ground. This is explored during sleeping. 51. The new relationship with the past. The relationship between the person who rebuilt and the past they carry, the past that includes the lost life with all its genuine goods and genuine costs, the loss itself with its genuine damages and its genuine clarifications, and the rebuilding with its genuine difficulties and genuine discoveries, is one of the more philosophically interesting dimensions of the testimony, and one that the people who rebuilt address with a care that reflects both the importance of the subject and the genuine difficulty of getting it right. The prior life was real, its goods were real, the relationships, the experiences, the things that were built and genuinely valued and genuinely lost. The grief for those goods is legitimate, and the people who rebuilt do not want it minimized. The prior life was also, in retrospect, a life that was carrying certain costs and certain blindnesses that the loss made visible, and the visibility of those costs and blindnesses is part of what the rebuilt life is built from. Both things are true, and the honest relationship with the past holds both rather than resolving the tension between them by emphasizing one at the expense of the other. What the people who rebuilt most consistently describe as the relationship with the past that serves the rebuilt life best is the relationship of honest acknowledgement, the relationship that neither idealizes the lost life into a version whose loss deserves to be mourned perpetually nor dismisses it as the inferior version that the rebuilt life correctly superseded. The lost life was what it was, genuinely good in some dimensions, genuinely limited in others, genuinely lost. The loss was what it was, genuinely damaging, genuinely clarifying, genuinely the occasion for the building of something more genuinely the person's own. Both realities, held together without the pressure to resolve the tension between them, produce a relationship with the past that the rebuilt life can be built from without being organized around, a past that is part of the inheritance rather than the organizing principle. 52. The discovery that they could be alone and be okay. The discovery that being alone, genuinely alone, not temporarily solitary, but structurally alone, without the partner or the household or the daily social architecture of the prior life, providing the constant background of human presence, was survivable and eventually more than survivable, was one of the more consistently described surprises of the rebuilding period, and one whose implications extended well beyond the practical question of whether the person could manage the logistics of the solitary life. The prior life had, in many cases, organized itself around the presence of another person or other people in ways that had made the solitary condition a theoretical rather than an experienced one. The person who had never been genuinely alone in the adult life, who had moved from the family home into shared accommodation, into the partnership and the household and the family, encountered in the conditions of the loss a solitude that was not chosen and that arrived without the prior experience that would have made its navigation more familiar. The initial experience of this solitude was consistently more difficult than the eventual experience of it. Difficult in the way that unfamiliar things are difficult, in the way that the absence of what one has always had is felt most sharply in the early period of its absence. What the extended experience of the genuine solitude revealed was a quality of the interior life, a richness, a self-sufficiency, a genuine interest in one's own company that the prior life's constant social architecture had been making unnecessary to develop, and that the solitude, by making it necessary, produced. The person who came through the solitude and who eventually, from the strength of the developed interior life, rather than from the need to escape the solitude, chose to re-enter the social world, entered it as a person who was in the social world by choice rather than by necessity. The difference, felt from the inside, was substantial. The prior social world had been inhabited partly from the necessity of not being alone. The rebuilt social world was inhabited from the genuine desire for connection. The desire, coming from the position of genuine sufficiency, produced a different quality of connection than the necessity had produced. 53. What the rebuilt life taught about priorities. The rebuilt life, organized from the cleared space of the loss, built from the clarified understanding of what actually mattered rather than the accumulated momentum of what had been building, tends to function, in the experience of the people who lived in it with genuine presence, as a continuous education in the difference between the things that feel urgent and the things that are important, and in the cost of consistently allowing the first category to consume the time and attention that the second category most genuinely requires. The prior life had been organized in large part by urgency, the deadline, the demand, the obligation that could not be deferred, the social expectation that had a cost attached to its non-fulfillment. These urgencies had consumed the available hours and had consistently displaced the things that were more important but less urgent, the relationship that needed time, the creative practice that needed the morning, the health that needed the walk, the interior life that needed the quiet, to the category of things to be attended to when there was time left over after the urgent things were addressed. There was rarely time left over. The important things accumulated in the deferred category and waited. The rebuilt life, built from the position of the clarified values and the reduced obligations of the early rebuilding period, tended to be organized differently, organized around the important rather than the urgent, because the urgent things of the prior life had been stripped away by the loss, and the important things had become, in the cleared space, the things that were actually present to be organized around. The people who rebuilt described the quality of the rebuilt daily life. The daily life organized primarily around what was genuinely important rather than primarily around what was urgently demanding, with a consistent warmth. The warmth of the person who has discovered what the day can contain when it is organized by genuine value rather than by accumulated demand. 54. The role of structure in the early rebuilding. The loss of the prior life removed, alongside the things that were genuinely missed and genuinely grieved, the structure of the prior life, the daily and weekly and seasonal rhythms of the prior existence, the schedule and the obligations, and the pattern of the ordinary days that had organized the time and provided the experience of the day as a thing with a shape. The removal of this structure was not mourned as specifically as the other losses, but it produced a disorientation that was, in the testimony of people who rebuilt, among the more practically consequential features of the early rebuilding period. The structureless day, the day without the schedule that the prior life's obligations had imposed, the day whose hours were available to be organized by the person rather than by the demands of the prior life, presented itself as a freedom that was also, initially, an overwhelming absence. The freedom of the unstructured time is not immediately experienced as freedom by the person who has never been required to provide their own structure from scratch. It is experienced as a kind of groundlessness, a condition in which the ordinary markers of the time's passage and the ordinary evidence of the day's productive use are absent, and in which the person's own initiative is the only available source of the structure that the prior life had been providing automatically. The people who rebuilt found that the deliberate creation of structure, the construction of a daily rhythm that was genuinely theirs rather than imposed by the prior life's obligations, was one of the most practically important early tasks of the rebuilding. Not the structure of the prior life reproduced in the new circumstances, but a new structure built from the genuine needs and the genuine values that the loss had clarified, the morning practice that was actually valued, the work period organized around genuine productivity rather than the performance of business, the regular contact with the people who were genuinely important. The structure they built was smaller and more personal than the prior structure had been. It was also, for the first time, genuinely theirs. 55. What they learned about success after having had it. The people who lost everything and rebuilt, and whose lost everything included, in many cases, a version of success that the surrounding culture would have recognized as such, carry a relationship to the concept of success that is different from the relationship carried by the person who has not yet had the experience of success's loss. The prior success was real, and the people who had it do not minimize the reality of it. But the having and the losing of it produced an understanding of what success actually was and what it was not, that the prior pursuit of it and the prior enjoyment of it had not fully provided. The understanding is this: success, in the form that the cultural narrative describes it, the career achievement, the financial position, the status and the recognition, provided while it was present, a quality of daily experience that was genuinely good in some dimensions and genuinely inadequate in others. And the inadequacies were not fully visible until the loss of the success made the question of what the success had actually been providing a genuinely open question rather than a rhetorical one. The prior success had been providing certain things: the external validation, the sense of direction and purpose that the pursuit of the goal gave to the daily activity, the social position, and the material comfort. It had not been providing other things, the things that the rebuilt life, which was materially less successful by the cultural measure, turned out to be more reliably capable of providing. The wisdom is not the dismissal of success or the counsel that success is not worth pursuing. It is the counsel of the realistic inventory, the honest assessment of what success actually provides and what it does not, what it is worth pursuing at the cost it requires and what it is not, and what the person who achieves it genuinely has and what they genuinely still need to find elsewhere. The loss of the success provided this inventory more completely than the possession of it had. The inventory, carried into the rebuilt life, organized the next pursuit more honestly than the prior one had been organized. 56. The unexpected mentor. Among the unexpected resources that the people who rebuilt most consistently describe as having appeared in the period of the rebuilding, resources whose presence was not anticipated and whose contribution to the rebuilding was disproportionate to the effort required to access them, is the person who had been through something similar and who was willing to share the account of how they had navigated it. The mentor who was not sought in the conventional sense of the mentor as a professional superior or an institutional guide, but who arrived in the conditions of the loss as the person who understood from the inside what the outside had not yet been able to explain. This person was not always easy to find. The cultural silence around major loss, the silence that shame and the management of appearances produce in the people who have been through it, means that the people who have rebuilt are not always visible as such, that the knowledge they carry is not always offered unless the conditions that make the offering possible are created. The conditions are created by the honest disclosure of the difficulty. The person who says, without the protective management of the appearance of having it together, that they are in the middle of the loss and that they are looking for the account of how someone else navigated it, that person creates the conditions in which the mentor appears, because the honest disclosure produces the response that the managed presentation forecloses. The people who rebuilt describe their mentors with a gratitude that reflects the enormous value of what the mentors provided. Not the advice, not the plan, not the prescription for the correct sequence of steps, but the testimony of the survivability. The mentor's primary function was not to tell the person what to do, but to demonstrate, by existing and by continuing, and by having been where the person now was and having come through it, that the coming through was possible. The testimony was the resource. The mentor was the living evidence. 57. What they now know about people who judge failure. The experience of public failure, the loss that was visible, that was known to the surrounding social world, that was the subject of the judgments that the surrounding social world applies to visible failure with a frequency and a confidence that the people who have been on the receiving end consistently describe as disproportionate to the quality of understanding that informs the judgments. Produced in the people who went through it an understanding of the phenomenon of judgment that is one of the more useful pieces of knowledge available from the rebuilt life. What they now know about the people who judged the failure is that the judgment was primarily about the judge rather than the judged. The person who responds to the visible failure of another person with judgment, with the narrative of the preventable mistake, the flawed character, the inadequate preparation that made the failure inevitable and distinguishes the failed person from the observer who would have done it differently, is the person who is managing their own fear of the same failure by constructing a story that places the failed person in a category that the observer does not occupy. The judgment is a protection. Its primary function is to reassure the judge that the same thing will not happen to them, because the same thing happened to the failed person for reasons that are the failed person's responsibility, and that the judge, not having those reasons, is immune to. The rebuilt person does not carry contempt for the people who judged them. They carry something more useful, the understanding of the dynamic that makes judgment of failure so common and so poorly informed, and the related understanding that the judgment, being primarily about the judge, carries far less actual information about the failed person than the social experience of being judged tends to feel like it does. The judgment was not the verdict it appeared to be. The person who survived it knows this from the direct experience of surviving it. The knowledge is, in the rebuilt life, one of the more liberating things they carry. 58. The discovery of what was worth protecting. The loss of the prior life produced, alongside its many disruptions and deprivations, a clarification of what in the prior life had been genuinely worth the effort of protection, genuinely valuable enough that its loss constituted a real diminishment of the life, and what had been protected out of habit or appearance or the accumulated momentum of the prior structure rather than out of genuine assessment of its value. This clarification was not available while the prior life was intact, because the intact life does not require the question to be asked. The loss asked it by removing everything at once and requiring the person to identify from the cleared space what they most wanted to rebuild. What was worth protecting turned out to be a shorter list than the prior life's complexity had suggested it would be. The things at the top of the list were consistently relational and interior rather than material and external. The relationships with the people who were genuinely important, the quality of the daily experience that was genuinely satisfying, the creative practice that was genuinely the person's own, the health that everything else depended on. The things further down the list, the status, the standard of living, the accumulated markers of the prior success, were worth something, but what they were worth turned out to be less than the prior life's organization around their protection had implied. The rebuilt life, organized around the protection of what was actually worth protecting rather than what the prior momentum had been protecting, tended to be more deliberately maintained than the prior life had been, maintained with the knowledge of what it cost to lose the things that mattered, and with the daily practice of the attention and the investment that the important things genuinely required, and that the prior life had been consistently diverting to the urgent things at the expense of the important ones. 59. The relationship between the loss and who they became. The person who emerged from the major loss and the rebuilding that followed it is connected to the loss in a way that is neither the connection of the victim, organized primarily around what was done to them, nor the connection of the person who has moved entirely past the loss and for whom it is simply the prior chapter. It is something more honest and more permanent than either. The connection of the person who is genuinely formed by the experience, who acknowledges the formation as part of what they are, and who carries the formation not as a wound that the subsequent life must accommodate, but as a dimension of the self that the subsequent life was built from. The formation is not simple or clean. It is the product of the full range of the experience, the grief and the fear and the anger and the shame and the gradual, effortful, nonlinear work of the rebuilding, and it carries the full range of its origins in the way that it presents itself in the rebuilt person's character. The depth of understanding that the experience produced is genuine depth, earned through the genuine experience rather than approximated through the theoretical consideration of it. The patience that the rebuilding installed, the patience that is the product of having been required to inhabit the duration of the difficult process, rather than the theoretical commitment to patience as a virtue, is genuine patience, available in the daily life not as a performance of patience, but as the actual condition of the person who has been genuinely patient in the conditions that most severely test it. The relationship between the loss and who they became is, in the testimony of the people who rebuilt most honestly, the relationship of genuine acknowledgement. The acknowledgement that the loss was real and that it cost what it cost, and the equally honest acknowledgement that the person who emerged from the cost is a person they would not have become any other way, carrying things that the comfortable life, which never required the testing, could not have produced. 60 lessons at 60, the portrait deepens. We stand at the 60th lesson, and the portrait of the person that the loss and the rebuilding produce, the person who emerges from the experience of having lost everything and having built again, has by now accumulated enough detail and enough honesty to be genuinely recognizable in the people around us, and perhaps in ourselves. In the last 10 lessons, we followed them through the honest relationship with the past that holds both the genuine goods of what was lost and the genuine clarifications that the loss provided. We accompanied them through the discovery of the sufficiency of the solitary interior life. We received their understanding of the difference between the urgent and the important, and what it costs to consistently allow the first to consume the time that the second most requires. We watched them build the structure that was genuinely theirs rather than imposed by the prior obligations. We received their recalibrated understanding of success, their gratitude for the unexpected mentor, their understanding of the judgment that was primarily about the judge, their clarity about what was worth protecting, and their honest relationship with the loss as a genuine formation of the person they became. What the 60 lessons assembled here have established is not an argument that loss is good or that the comfortable life is inferior to the tested one. It is the honest testimony of people who went through the hardest thing available in the ordinary civilian life and who came through it carrying something that the comfortable life does not produce, a quality of knowledge about what matters and what endures, and what the human being is actually capable of that is only available from the inside of the genuine experience of losing and rebuilding. 40 lessons remain. They carry the deepest parts of the testimony. This is explored during sleeping. 61. The freedom that came with having less to lose. Among the changes in the daily experience of life that the rebuilt life produced, changes that were not sought and not anticipated, and that arrived as something between a discovery and a surprise. One of the most consistently described and the most genuinely valued is a quality of freedom that the prior life, with its accumulated possessions and its accumulated obligations and its accumulated reputation to be maintained, had not been able to provide. The freedom of having less to lose. The freedom of the person whose prior holding has been removed and who finds, in the removal, the release of the anxiety that the holding had been generating. The anxiety of the prior life was, in many cases, organized substantially around the protection of what was held. The financial position, the reputation, the standard of living, the social standing. The protection required the maintenance, and the maintenance required the anxiety, the continuous background concern about the conditions that might threaten what was being maintained, the decisions made conservatively in the service of protecting the position rather than in the service of the genuine assessment of the opportunity. The anxiety was not visible as anxiety from inside the prior life. Because it was so thoroughly integrated into the ordinary condition of the comfortable life, that it had ceased to register as a distinct feature of the experience and had become simply the baseline of the existence. The loss removed the baseline and revealed it. The person who had been carrying the weight of the maintenance discovered, in the conditions of no longer having anything to maintain, the specific lightness of the person who has nothing left to protect. This is not a comfortable discovery in its occasion. The loss is not a comfortable occasion, but the quality it produces in the rebuilt life is one that the people who rebuilt describe with a consistent warmth. The warmth of the person who acts now from the genuine assessment of the thing before them rather than from the calculation of the risk to the position, who speaks now from what they actually think rather than from what the maintenance of the prior standing required, who tries things now because the downside of the next failure is the known downside, and the known downside has already been survived. 62. What they learned about forgiveness. Forgiveness in the context of major loss is one of the most carefully and most honestly addressed subjects in the testimony. Carefully addressed because it is the subject most vulnerable to the specific kinds of cultural oversimplification that the experiences of loss and rebuilding make, in the people who have been through them, most obviously inadequate. The oversimplifications come from both directions. The counsel that forgiveness is necessary for recovery and should therefore be pursued with urgency, and the counsel that forgiveness is a betrayal of the legitimate grievance and should therefore be refused in the name of self-respect. The people who rebuilt found both of these positions too simple and ultimately unhelpful, and the understanding they arrived at was more nuanced and more honest than either. The forgiveness that the testimony describes is not the forgiveness as resolution that the cultural narrative of personal growth tends to present. The clean, dramatic, concluded act of releasing the grievance and returning to peace. It is a more gradual and more ambivalent process, the gradual reduction of the organizing power of the grievance over the daily interior life, the gradual shifting of the primary relationship to the experience from the relationship with what was done to them toward the relationship with what they were building. The grievance did not disappear. The wrong was not minimized. The person who caused the loss was not absolved. What changed was the proportion of the available attention that was being directed toward the maintaining of the grievance relative to the proportion directed toward the building of the rebuilt life. Self-forgiveness dimension of the subject is addressed in the testimony with as much care as the forgiveness of others, and in some cases with more. The forgiveness of the self for the role played in the loss, however partial that role was, the forgiveness of the self for the ways the prior life was lived that the loss retrospectively revealed as flawed, the forgiveness of the self for not having known, at the time the decisions were made, what the loss subsequently made clear. This self-forgiveness is not the erasure of the regret. It is the refusal to allow the regret to become the primary relationship with the self. The regret is acknowledged. The self is not condemned for what it could not have known when the knowing was needed. 63. The rebuilt relationship, harder and more genuine. The relationships that survived the loss and continued into the rebuilt life, the marriage that was tested by the financial collapse, the friendship that persisted through the years of the rebuilding, the family connection that was maintained through the period of the shame and the difficulty, are described in the testimony with a quality of appreciation that reflects the weight of what the relationships were required to carry and the significance of the fact that they carried it. These relationships are not the same relationships that existed before the loss. They were transformed by what they were required to absorb, and the transformation made them, in the experience of the people who rebuilt, more genuinely what relationships are supposed to be than the prior versions had managed to be in the more comfortable conditions. The transformation was not painless. The loss created conditions in the relationships that the comfortable conditions had not created. The conditions of genuine need, of the honest disclosure of difficulty, of the requirement to be actually present in the discomfort of another person's crisis rather than the supportive adjacent presence of the person who is there for the good things and manageably available for the moderate difficulties. Not all relationships survived these conditions. The ones that survived were the ones that were actually what they appeared to be, the connections that had genuine depth rather than the depth that comfort generates through proximity and shared experience without genuine testing. The people who rebuilt described the relationships that survived with a warmth that has the quality of earned appreciation rather than sentimental attachment. The warmth of the person who knows the relationship was tested and that the testing revealed something real. The relationship that continues through the genuine crisis is the relationship that the person knows, from the direct evidence of the continuing, is genuinely what it claims to be. This knowledge, the direct, non-hypothetical knowledge of the relationship's actual character, is one of the things the loss provided. The relationships it revealed as genuine are among the most valued possessions of the rebuilt life. 64. What the loss taught them about time. The relationship with time that the experience of major loss produces in the person who passes through it is different from the relationship with time that the prior life had allowed to develop. Different in a direction that connects the rebuilt person's daily experience to something that the comfortable life consistently prevents from being fully felt. The genuine finitude of the days, the genuine irreversibility of the hours, the genuine weight of the fact that the time being spent and is not coming back. The prior life had allowed the relationship with time to be casual in a way that the loss made impossible to maintain. The loss installed in the daily experience a quality of temporal awareness that the comfort of the prior life had been obscuring. This awareness is not the anxious, clock-watching awareness of the person who is always measuring what they have against what they have left and finding the ratio unfavorable. It is a different quality, closer to the awareness of the person who knows, from direct experience rather than from philosophical reflection, that the day is genuinely the thing being spent, and that the spending of it in ways that are not genuinely worth it is a real cost rather than a theoretical one. The person who lost years to the management of the prior life's complexity, who deferred the important things in favor of the urgent things for long enough that the deferral accumulated into a significant portion of the adult life, carries the direct evidence of what that deferral cost in a form that the person who has not yet paid that cost cannot access through imagination alone. The wisdom this awareness produces is the wisdom of the deliberate day, the day whose hours are organized to the extent that the circumstances allow around what is genuinely worth the spending. Not the perfect day. The testimony is not about perfection, but the day that is noticed, that is inhabited with enough presence that its contents are genuinely experienced rather than elapsed. The loss installed the awareness. The rebuilt life practices it, imperfectly and with varying success, as the most important daily discipline available to the person who has learned what the time actually costs. 65. The wisdom of starting small. The cultural narrative of the comeback, the dramatic, large-scale return from the major loss to something that surpasses the prior level of achievement, is one of the most pervasive and one of the most unhelpful frameworks available to the person who is in the early period of rebuilding. Unhelpful because it consistently draws the attention toward the large and the distant at exactly the moment when the small and the immediate are what the rebuilding most practically requires. The people who rebuilt most effectively describe not the dramatic comeback, but the patient accumulation of the small steps, each modest in isolation and significant in their accumulation, that produced over time the rebuilt life that the dramatic narrative would have attributed to a single turning point that did not, in their experience, exist. The wisdom of starting small is the wisdom of the realistic relationship with the current position, the acknowledgement that the current position is the position that the rebuilding must begin from, regardless of where the prior position was or where the imagined future position is intended to be. The current position is often modest. The resources available at the beginning of the rebuilding are often limited. The plan that begins from where the person actually is, with the resources they actually have, toward the goal that is actually achievable from that position, tends to produce more forward movement than the plan that begins from the position they wish they were in or the goal that the dramatic comeback narrative suggests is the appropriate destination. The small step is also the step that builds the evidence of efficacy, the accumulated demonstration that action produces results, that the person is capable of moving forward from the current position, that the next step is possible because the last step was taken and survived. The small win, taken repeatedly and accumulated over time, produced the rebuilt life. The dramatic turning point, waited for rather than walked toward, rarely arrived in the form that the waiting had imagined it. They walked in small steps, they arrived. 66. The person they became for others in crisis. Among the unexpected consequences of having been through major loss and rebuilt from it, consequences that the people who went through the experience could not have anticipated from the position of the prior life, and that arrived in the rebuilt life with the quality of something that was earned rather than simply received, is the quality of presence they became capable of offering to other people who were in their own versions of the crisis. Not the presence of the advisor or the consultant or the person who had the answers to the questions the other person was asking. The presence of the witness, the person who had been there and who could therefore be genuinely present in someone else's there in a way that the person who had not been there could not quite manage. The crisis of another person tends to produce in the observer who has not been through an equivalent crisis a set of responses that are genuinely well-intentioned and genuinely inadequate. The advice, the plan, the reassurance that things will be fine, the various forms of help that the helping person knows how to offer and that the person in the crisis does not primarily need. The person who has been through the equivalent crisis knows from the inside what is not needed, which is all of the above, and what is actually needed, which tends to be simpler and more difficult. The genuine presence of the person who is not frightened by the crisis, who can sit with its full weight without needing it to be resolved quickly, who can offer the testimony of the survivability without insisting on the timing of the surviving. People who rebuilt describe their capacity for this presence as one of the genuine gifts of the experience, the gift of the person whose usefulness to another person in crisis is not diminished by the crisis's unresolvability, who can be with the person in the depths without requiring the depths to be less deep. This capacity is not available without the experience. The experience produced it. The rebuilt person carries it as one of the things that the loss gave them that they can give to others. 67. What they stopped caring about. The rebuilt life is not only the life that was constructed from the clarified values and the recovered resources. It is also the life from which certain things were simply not rebuilt, not because the resources were insufficient to rebuild them, but because the process of the clarification revealed them as not worth rebuilding. The things not worth rebuilding were not always the things the prior life had treated as unimportant. Some of them were things the prior life had been organized, in significant part, around the social standing, the performance of the successful life, for the audience of people whose judgment of the performance had organized a substantial portion of the prior decisions. The loss of the social standing, the visible, public dimension of the major loss, produced initially a grief and a shame that the prior life's investment in the standing had made proportionate. The standing was lost, and the loss of it was felt as a real loss. But the rebuilding, conducted necessarily in the reduced conditions and necessarily with the resources that were actually available rather than the resources that the prior standard required, produced a gradual erosion of the investment in the standing, not through the philosophical decision that standing was unimportant, but through the practical daily experience of building and living without it and finding, in the building and the living, that the absence of the prior standing was not the deprivation that the prior investment in it had made it appear it would be. The relief that arrived when the caring about the standing, about the judgment of the people whose judgment had been organizing the prior decisions, genuinely diminished, is described in the testimony with a vividness that reflects its significance. The relief of the person who has been carrying a weight they did not know was a weight, and who sets it down and feels the difference. They stopped caring about certain things. The stopping was not a choice made at a particular moment. It was the gradual product of the rebuilt life's sustained demonstration that the things they had stopped caring about were not necessary for the quality of the daily experience they were now living. The relief was immediate. It was also permanent. 68. The discovery of what they were actually good at. The prior life had organized its assessment of the person's capacities around the capacities that the prior life's demands had required. The professional competence, the skills of the career, the abilities that the prior structure had developed and rewarded, and that had therefore come to be understood as the primary account of what the person could do. The loss of the prior structure removed the prior account and produced, in the cleared space of the rebuilding, a more complete and in some ways more accurate inventory of what the person was actually capable of. The inventory included things the prior life had not required and had therefore not developed, whose presence in the person's actual capacity had been invisible not because it was not there, but because the prior structure had not created the conditions in which it was needed. The person who discovered, in the conditions of the rebuilding, that they were capable of navigating genuine financial uncertainty with a practical intelligence they did not know they had. The person who discovered, in the conditions of the reduced social world of the early rebuilding, that they were capable of a quality of self-directed creative work that the prior life's social business had been crowding out. The person who discovered, in the conditions of the loss of the prior role, that the qualities that made them genuinely effective were not role-dependent, that the competence was more portable than the prior career had suggested. The people who rebuilt described the discovery of these previously invisible capacities with the particular warmth of the found thing, the warmth of the person who has been in possession of something valuable without knowing it and who discovers it in the conditions that make it visible. The loss made the inventory necessary. The inventory was more complete than the prior life had required it to be. The completeness changed the assessment of what was available for the rebuilding, and the rebuilt life was built partly from resources that the prior life had never needed to identify. 69. The loss as teacher. The attempt to extract from the experience of major loss and rebuilding the essential lesson, the thing that the experience most directly and most lastingly taught, distilled from the full range of what the loss deposited in the person who went through it, produces in the testimony an answer that is both simple and difficult. Simple in its statement and difficult in the sense that it cannot be fully learned anywhere other than in the conditions that produce it. The lesson that the person is the foundation. Not the house, not the career, not the relationship, not the financial position, not the social standing, the person. The bare, undecoratable, imperfect, genuinely capable person standing in the rubble of the prior life with nothing to rely on but themselves, who turns out to be sufficient. This is the lesson the loss teaches. It is not available through any other curriculum. It is not available through the philosophical reflection on what would remain if everything were removed. Because the philosophical reflection is conducted from a position of comfort that makes the removal theoretical rather than actual, and that therefore cannot provide the embodied knowledge that the actual removal produces. The lesson requires the experience. The experience requires the loss. The people who rebuilt carry this lesson not as a consolation for the cost of the experience. The cost was real, and the consolation is not that the lesson was worth the cost, because the person who paid the cost did not get to choose whether to pay it. They carry it as the honest assessment of what the experience most permanently and most valuably produced, the direct, irreplaceable, fully embodied knowledge that they are the foundation of their own life, that the foundation is solid, and that the building that can be built on a solid foundation is capable of being genuinely good. This is the lesson the lost taught. It is theirs now. They want to pass it on. 70. Lessons at 70. The deepest understanding. We stand at the 70th lesson, and the testimony of the people who lost everything and started over has now been followed through 7/10 of its full length, through the full range of the experience from the moment of the loss to the rebuilt life in its maturity, from the bottom that turned out to be solid to the daily practice of the rebuilt existence organized around the clarified values. In the last 10 lessons, we received some of the most personally significant and the most practically applicable pieces of the testimony. The freedom that came with having less to lose, the honest account of forgiveness in its actual rather than its idealized form, the rebuilt relationship that was harder and more genuine, the new relationship with time, the wisdom of the small step, the quality of presence the rebuilt person could offer to others in crisis, the relief of stopped caring, the discovered capacities, and the central lesson of the loss itself, that the person is the foundation, and that the foundation is solid, and that the building that can be built from it is capable of being genuinely good. What the 70 lessons assembled here have established is the full arc of the experience, the descent, the bottom, the turning toward the rebuilding, the patient accumulation of the small steps, the nonlinear progress, the clarifications, the discoveries, and the gradual emergence of the rebuilt life as something genuinely inhabited rather than provisionally occupied. 30 lessons remain. They carry the final dimensions of the testimony, the wisdom that only the full arc of the experience makes visible, the things the rebuilt person most wants to say to the person still in the rubble. This is explored during sleeping. 71. The rebuilt life had its own beauty. The discovery that the rebuilt life, the life that was constructed from the cleared space of the loss, with the reduced resources and the clarified values and the smaller social world of the early rebuilding, possessed a quality of beauty that was genuinely its own rather than a diminished version of the beauty of what preceded it, is one of the most consistently described and the most quietly significant findings in the testimony. It tends to arrive not as a dramatic revelation, but as a gradual recognition, the recognition that the daily experience of the rebuilt life, attended to with the presence that the prior life had not always been able to sustain, contained pleasures and satisfactions and qualities of the ordinary moment that were genuine and complete, rather than the consolation prizes for the lost goods that the early period of the rebuilding had feared they would be. The beauty of the rebuilt life is a different kind of beauty from the beauty of the prior life. The prior life's beauty tended to be the beauty of the abundant and the achieved, the house that was exactly what was wanted, the career at its peak of accomplishment, the social world full and varied and confirming. The rebuilt life's beauty tends to be the beauty of the essential and the sufficient, the morning that is genuinely inhabited because the quiet makes the inhabiting possible, the relationship that is more deeply known because the social world it exists in is smaller and the attention available for it is less divided, the work that is genuinely the person's own because the clearing of the prior obligations left only the things that were actually worth doing. This beauty is not available at the beginning. It is not available in the depths of the loss or in the early period of the rebuilding when the gap between where the person is and where they were is still the most dominant feature of the daily experience. It arrives with the accumulated time of the actual lived rebuilt life, with the months and years of daily inhabiting of the built thing that gradually reveal its genuine character rather than its character in comparison to what preceded it. The comparison fades, the thing itself becomes visible, and the thing itself, seen on its own terms, is genuinely beautiful. 72. What they learned about identity through loss. The understanding of identity that the experience of major loss produces, the understanding that is available only to the person who has had the externals of their identity stripped away and who has been required to find out what, if anything, persists when the external supports are gone, is one of the most philosophically significant and the most personally transformative pieces of knowledge that the testimony contains. It is the answer to the question that the loss forces: who am I when everything I was using to answer that question is gone? The answer, in the consistent experience of the people who rebuilt, is more interesting and more durable than the prior collection of external markers had suggested it would be. What persists when the career and the house and the social position are removed is not the emptiness that the fear of identity loss had predicted. It is the person, the actual, particular, irreducible person whose character and whose values and whose ways of engaging with the world are not properties of the external things, but properties of the interior that the external things were, at best, reflecting and expressing, and at worst, partially obscuring. The person who discovers this in the conditions of the genuine loss has replaced the theoretical understanding of identity with the empirical one. They know from the direct experience of having had the external supports removed and having found themselves still standing that they are not the supports. This understanding changes the subsequent relationship with external things. The career, when it is rebuilt, is understood as an expression of the person rather than a definition of them. The house, when it is inhabited, is understood as a container rather than a foundation. The social standing, when it is restored in some form, is understood as a description of a position rather than a description of the person. The things are real and their value is real. But they are not what the person is, and the person who knows this from direct experience has a relationship with those things that is different, more honest, more proportionate, more capable of genuine enjoyment without the anxiety of the person who confuses the thing with themselves and therefore experiences the thing's vulnerability as their own. 73. The moment they chose the rebuilt life. There is a moment in the experience of the rebuilt life, a moment that arrives at different times for different people and that is recognized with varying degrees of consciousness at the time of its occurrence, when the person stops experiencing the rebuilt life as the life they are living because the prior life was lost, and starts experiencing it as the life they are living because it is genuinely their life. The shift from the involuntary to the chosen, from the life they are in because the prior life ended to the life they are in because this is the life they are building and inhabiting and genuinely claiming as their own, is one of the most significant interior transitions of the entire recovery arc. The shift is not made at a particular decision point in the way that the dramatic narrative of the comeback tends to suggest. It is not the moment the new business reaches profitability, or the moment the new relationship becomes committed, or the moment the financial position returns to stability. It is the interior moment, quieter than any of those, less visible from the outside, more significant from the inside, when the comparison between the rebuilt life and the lost life ceases to be the primary frame through which the rebuilt life is understood. When the rebuilt life is no longer experienced primarily in relation to what preceded it, but in relation to what it actually is. The people who describe this moment describe it with a quality of relief and recognition that reflects both its significance and the duration of the rebuilding period that preceded it. The relief is the relief of the person who has been orienting primarily toward the past and who has, at this moment, turned primarily toward the present. The recognition is the recognition of the rebuilt life as genuinely theirs, not the consolation for the lost life, not the lesser version of the prior arrangement, but the actual life of the actual person they have become. They chose it, not at its beginning, when the choice was made for them by the loss. At this moment, when the choice is genuinely theirs to make, they made it. The rebuilding became the life. 74. What they know about suffering that comfort cannot teach. The understanding of suffering that the experience of major loss deposits in the person who goes through it. The understanding that is available only from the inside of the genuine experience, not from the observation of it at a distance, and not from the philosophical reflection on it in the conditions of the comfort that has not yet been seriously tested, is one of the most important and the most carefully transmitted dimensions of the testimony. It is carefully transmitted because the people who carry it are aware of the specific ways in which its misapplication can produce the very suffering it is intended to address, and because the understanding itself resists the forms of simplification that the cultural narrative of resilience tends to apply to it. What they know about suffering is that it is not the opposite of the good life. It is not the interruption of the good life. It is one of the conditions of the full life, one of the experiences that the full life, lived with genuine engagement rather than constant management of the exposure to difficulty, will at some point contain. The person who has organized their life primarily around the avoidance of suffering has organized it around a negative, around the prevention of the thing rather than the pursuit of the thing, around the protection of the comfort rather than the genuine engagement with the range of what is available to be experienced. The person who has been through the genuine suffering and who has survived the surviving knows something that the comfort cannot teach, that the suffering is survivable, that the surviving of it produces something real, and that the life that has been through the genuine difficulty and that has emerged from the difficulty carrying what the difficulty gave it is a richer and more complete life than the life that has been successfully protected from the difficulty's approach. This is not the counsel to seek suffering. It is the counsel of the honest assessment of what a full life contains, offered by the people who have been through the full range and who would not, having been through it, choose the protected version in its place. 75. The relationship between loss and genuine connection. The loss of the prior life produced, among its many consequences, a change in the person's capacity for genuine connection with other people, a change in the direction of depth, produced by the removal of the prior life's management of the presented self and the installation, in its place, of the honest vulnerability that genuine connection requires, and that the comfortable life tends to make it possible to defer indefinitely. The prior life had allowed, and in some cases had required, the maintenance of a social distance from the full reality of the person's interior, a distance that was maintained through the performed competence, through the management of the appearances of stability, through the various strategies by which the person had been presenting a curated version of themselves to the people in their social world, rather than the actual version. The loss ended the maintenance of the distance, not through any deliberate decision to be more genuinely known, but through the simple impossibility of maintaining the performance in the conditions where the performance had become untenable. The person in the genuine crisis is visible in the genuine crisis. The visibility, initially experienced as a vulnerability, turned out to produce something that the management of the appearances had been preventing: the response of the people who could see the genuine person and who responded to the genuine person rather than to the performance. The genuine response to the genuine person was different from the polite response to the performed one. It was closer, it was more sustaining. It was the beginning of the kind of connection that the comfortable life's management of the appearances had been consistently postponing. The people who rebuilt described the quality of the connections that the vulnerability made possible as among the most valued goods of the rebuilt life. Connections that were built from the honest account rather than from the managed presentation, that had a depth that the prior life's social world had rarely provided, and that were more genuinely nourishing than the broader but shallower social world of the comfortable years had been. The loss opened the door that the comfort had kept closed. What came through the door was worth the opening. 76. The capacity for joy after loss. Among the dimensions of the rebuilt life that the people who went through the loss and the rebuilding most consistently describe as having surprised them in the direction of the good, in the form of something that the prior understanding of what was available after the major loss had not fully prepared them to receive, is the capacity for genuine joy that eventually returned. Not immediately, not quickly, not without the full experience of its opposite preceding it, but genuinely in the form of an actual pleasure in the actual present moment that was distinct from the relief of the crisis's passing and distinct from the satisfaction of the practical rebuilding's progress. And that was, when it arrived, more vivid and more fully felt than the ordinary pleasures of the prior comfortable life had tended to be. The vividness is understood by the people who describe it as the product of the contrast. The person who has genuinely been in the absence of joy and who has survived the absence, and whose capacity for the experience of joy has been restored by the gradual progress of the rebuilding, experiences joy in the present moment with a completeness that the person whose access to joy has never been seriously disrupted cannot achieve by the same means. The ordinary pleasure is not taken for granted by the person who knows from direct experience what the ordinary day looks like when the pleasure is absent. The laughter is more fully received by the person who remembers the period when the laughter was not available. The ordinary morning is more genuinely inhabited by the person who has been in the mornings when nothing about the morning was ordinary. The return of genuine joy is not the sign that the loss has been resolved or that the grief has been completed. It is the sign that the person is still alive in the full sense, still capable of the full range of the experience that is available to the living, including the dimension of the experience that the loss had temporarily removed. The joy returned, not as the joy of the prior life, which was the joy of the person before the loss, as the joy of the rebuilt person who knows what it costs and who receives it accordingly. 77. The thing the loss gave that they would not give back. The testimony of the people who lost everything and rebuilt contains, alongside the honest account of the costs and the honest account of the rebuilding's difficulties, a dimension that is the most carefully stated and the most important for the person in the middle of the loss to hear. The account of what the experience gave them that they would not, if the giving back were an available option, choose to return. This is not the sentiment of the person who has minimized the cost or who has converted the loss into a gift through the insistence that everything happens for a reason. It is the honest assessment of the person who has paid the full cost of the experience and who has also, alongside the cost, received certain things that the cost produced and that are genuinely theirs now and genuinely worth having. What they would not give back varies across the individual testimonies as completely as the losses themselves varied. The self-knowledge, the direct, empirical, fully embodied knowledge of what they are made of and what they can endure and what they can build, is the thing most consistently named. The clarity about what actually matters, which the loss produced by removing everything and leaving only what was actually important, is named with equal frequency. The depth of the connections that the vulnerability made possible, the creative capacity that the prior structure had been suppressing, the freedom from the performances that the prior standing had been requiring, the patience and the equanimity and the recalibrated relationship with risk. These things are named, individually and collectively, as the things the experience gave them, that the experience took something real to produce, and that they now hold as genuine possessions of the rebuilt self. They did not choose to purchase these things at the price the purchasing cost. The price was not their choice, but the things are real, and they are genuinely valued, and the person who has them and who knows what they cost is the person who tends to hold them most carefully. 78. The difference between the performed life and the lived one. Among the understandings that the experience of major loss and rebuilding most consistently and most permanently produces in the person who goes through it, one of the most practically consequential for the quality of the daily experience of the rebuilt life is the understanding of the difference between the performed life and the lived one, between the life that is organized primarily around the maintenance of a version of the self for the audience of the social world, and the life that is organized primarily around the genuine daily experience of the person who is living it. The prior life had been, in many cases, substantially a performed life, organized around the external account of the self that the social world was receiving and maintaining rather than around the interior experience of the person generating the performance. The performance was not dishonest in any simple sense. It was the ordinary social management of the presented self that the adult life requires, taken in the direction of the comfortable life's tendency to expand the performance to fill the available space. The performance had become the primary relationship with the daily existence, and the interior experience had become the secondary one, the thing noticed after the performance's demands had been met, if any attention remained for it. The loss disrupted the performance permanently, not by making the person more honest in a dramatic sense, but by removing the circumstances that the performance had been designed for. The rebuilt life required a different and more genuine relationship with the daily experience, because the daily experience was now, in its reduced and quieter form, more directly present and less mediated by the prior structure's demands. The person who inhabited the rebuilt life with genuine presence, who attended to the actual quality of the actual day rather than to the management of the day's appearance, found in that inhabiting a quality of daily experience that the performed life, for all its apparent fullness, had not been providing. The lived life was quieter. It was also more genuinely theirs. 79. The wisdom of the incomplete. The rebuilt life, when it is honestly described, is incomplete. Not incomplete in the sense of being unfinished, it is being lived, which is the only form in which a life can be complete, but incomplete in the sense that the prior life's losses were not entirely made good, that the rebuilt life is genuinely different from what the prior life would have become if the loss had not occurred, and that the difference is not entirely neutral in its evaluation. Some things that were lost were genuinely valuable and are genuinely absent from the rebuilt life in ways that the rebuilt life acknowledges rather than denies. The wisdom of the incomplete is the wisdom of the honest relationship with what is and what is not. The relationship that neither requires the rebuilt life to be the full replacement for everything the prior life contained, nor requires the absence of what was lost to be denied in the name of the gratitude for what was built. Both things can be true simultaneously. The rebuilt life is genuinely good, and things that were lost are genuinely absent, and the person living the rebuilt life is genuinely glad to be living it and also genuinely aware of what is not in it. The completeness of the prior life was also, in retrospect, a kind of fiction. The comfortable life always contains absences whose absence the comfort makes invisible. The rebuilt life is honest about what it contains and what it does not. The people who rebuilt describe this quality of honest incompleteness as one of the features of the rebuilt life that they value rather than regret value, because the honesty about the incomplete is itself a form of the genuine inhabiting of the actual life rather than a performance of the life as fully sufficient. The rebuilt life is enough. The enough is real. The things that are absent are also real. Holding both without the pressure to resolve the tension between them is one of the things the loss taught, and one of the things the rebuilt life most genuinely practices. 80 lessons at 80. Almost everything has been said. We stand at the 80th lesson, and the testimony of the people who lost everything and started over is nearly complete. 20 lessons from the end of the account, 20 lessons from the place where the testimony returns to the essential thing and offers it as directly and as honestly as the words allow. In the last 10 lessons, we receive some of the most personally significant pieces of the testimony: the discovery of the rebuilt life's own beauty, the understanding of identity that the loss forced into directness, the moment the rebuilt life was genuinely chosen rather than merely inhabited. We receive the honest account of what suffering teaches that comfort cannot, the opening of genuine connection through vulnerability, the return of genuine joy, and what made it more vivid than before. We heard what they would not give back, understood the difference between the performed life and the lived one, and received the wisdom of the honest acknowledgement of the incomplete. The 20 lessons that remain carry the final voice of the testimony, the things the rebuilt person most wants to say to the person still in the rubble, and the things that the full arc of the experience most needs to leave behind for the people who will come to the same rubble in their own time. The testimony has been patient. Its final words are close. This is explored during sleeping. 81. What they want to tell the person currently in the rubble. The person who is currently in the rubble, who is in the period immediately following the loss, when the prior life is gone and the rebuilt life has not yet taken any form that could be called a life, and when the distance between where they are and where they need to be feels too large to be genuinely traversable, is the person toward whom the testimony of the people who rebuilt is most directly and most urgently directed. Not toward the person who is safely through the difficult period and who is now in a position to receive the testimony as information about an experience they survived. Toward the person who is in it now, who cannot yet see the other side, who is standing in the cleared space with nothing built yet and no evidence available from inside the current moment that building is genuinely possible. What the people who rebuilt most want that person to know is the same thing they wish someone had told them when they were in the same position: that the current position is not the permanent position, that the cleared space, which feels at this moment like the definitive statement of what has been and what remains, is the beginning of the rebuilding rather than the conclusion of the loss. That the absence of evidence from inside the current moment that the rebuilt life will be genuinely good is not itself evidence that the rebuilt life will not be genuinely good. The evidence is not available from the current position. It will be available later, from a position that the current person cannot yet occupy. They want the person in the rubble to know that the bottom is solid, that the grief is survivable, that the timeline is longer than the culture will make the person feel it should be, and that the longer timeline is the right one rather than evidence of a failed recovery. That the people who stay are worth more than the people who go, and that the loss of the people who go is a clarification rather than a diminishment. That the small step is the right step for the current position. And that the person standing in the rubble, imperfect, frightened, reduced in circumstances, uncertain of the path, is already in possession of the most important thing the rebuilding requires. They are still there. They are the foundation. The foundation is enough. 82. The quality of the morning in the rebuilt life. The morning of the rebuilt life, the daily beginning of the day as it presents itself to the person who has been through the loss and the rebuilding, and who is now inhabiting the actually rebuilt existence rather than constructing it, is described in the testimony with a quality of warmth and attention that reflects the genuine difference between the prior life's relationship to the morning and the rebuilt life's relationship to it. The prior life's morning had been, for many of the people who describe it in retrospect, primarily the beginning of the day's obligations, the assessment of the to-do list, the preparation for the demands ahead, the mobilization of the self for the management of the prior life's complexity. The morning was the gateway to the day's requirements, and the quality of the morning was largely determined by the quality of the requirements that lay ahead. The difficult day produced a difficult morning. The manageable day produced a manageable morning. The morning itself, as a thing with its own qualities independent of what it was introducing, was rarely the subject of the morning's attention. The rebuilt life's morning tends to be experienced differently, not because the mornings are more dramatic or more eventful, but because the person experiencing them is more genuinely present in them, more attentive to their actual contents rather than to what the contents are introducing. The morning light, the warm cup. The brief period before the day's demands assemble, which is longer in the simpler rebuilt life than it was in the prior one, and which is inhabited with more genuine presence by the person who knows, from direct experience, what the morning looks like when it is not available in the ordinary form. The rebuilt morning is ordinary. The rebuilding made the ordinary morning visible. The visibility, maintained in the daily practice of the rebuilt life, is one of the most consistent and most genuine pleasures of the existence the rebuilding produced. 83. What they learned about the nature of hope. The understanding of hope that the experience of major loss produces, the understanding that is available only to the person who has had the prior hope stripped away and who has been required to find out whether hope persists in the conditions of its own defeat, is one of the most philosophically interesting and the most personally significant pieces of the testimony. It is the account of hope, as the people who have been in the conditions of its genuine test describe it from the inside, which turns out to be different from hope, as the person who has not been in those conditions tends to imagine it. The prior hope, the hope of the comfortable life, organized primarily around the anticipation of the future's continued improvement, the expectation that the trajectory of the prior life would continue in the direction it had been heading, was not, in retrospect, primarily hope. It was expectation. The comfortable life generates expectation rather than hope, the sense that the future will be continuous with the present, that the things being built will continue to be built, that the trajectory is the likely trajectory. This expectation is not examined as a form of hope because it does not feel precarious in the way that hope feels precarious. It feels like confidence. The loss of the prior life revealed the expectation as expectation by defeating it, and the defeat of the expectation was experienced as the defeat of hope. But what the people who rebuilt discovered, in the conditions where the expectation had been defeated, was that the actual hope, the hope that does not depend on the trajectory's continuation, that is not the expectation of the continued comfortable life, but the more fundamental orientation of the person who is still alive and still capable of building, was not defeated with the expectation. It persisted, quieter and less certain, and more genuinely hopeful than the expectation had been in the cleared space of the loss. The actual hope, it turned out, was not the expectation of the continued comfortable life. It was the orientation toward the possibility of the next thing, whatever the next thing was, that the person's continued existence and continued capacity made genuinely available. 84. The relationship between loss and gratitude. The relationship between the experience of major loss and the capacity for genuine gratitude is one of the more paradoxical and more consistently described dimensions of the testimony. Paradoxical because the loss is objectively the occasion of deprivation, and the gratitude is the response to genuine goods, and the coexistence of the two is not, in the comfortable life's framework, obviously available. The person in the conditions of the genuine loss is not in the conditions that the ordinary understanding of gratitude associates with the gratitude response. And yet the testimony of the people who rebuilt consistently identifies a quality of gratitude that the loss produced, not despite the loss, but as a consequence of it, through the mechanism of the clarification and the contrast and the return of the ordinary goods that the loss had temporarily removed. The gratitude that the loss produced is more durable and more genuine than the gratitude that the comfortable life occasionally generated. The comfortable life's gratitude was, in most cases, intermittent and surface level, the periodically acknowledged awareness that the circumstances were good, which was periodically replaced by the ordinary inattention to the circumstances that the comfortable life's constancy tended to produce. The loss replaced the comfortable life's constancy with the absence of the comfortable life's goods, and the subsequent return of those goods, in the rebuilt life, in the ordinary forms that the ordinary day provides, was received with the quality of attention and appreciation that the prior constancy had made difficult to sustain. The person who has been in the genuine absence of the ordinary goods of the ordinary day the safety, the warm cup, the unremarkable Tuesday returns to those goods in the rebuilt life as the person who knows what they are worth. The knowing changes the receiving. The gratitude that the rebuilt person practices is not the performed gratitude of the spiritual discipline, though it shares the form of the deliberate attention to the present goods. It is the genuine response of the person who knows, from the direct experience of the alternative, exactly how good the ordinary morning actually is. 85. What they know about the untested. The people who have been through major loss and rebuilt carry a relationship to the people who have not been through equivalent testing that is not contempt. The testimony is consistent in its refusal of the superior positioning of the person who has suffered toward the person who has not. But that contains a specific quality of knowledge about the untested that the untested person is not in a position to fully share. What they know about the untested is not that the untested are wrong about anything in particular. It is that the untested person's understanding of their own capacity, of what they would do, of how they would manage, of who they would prove to be in the conditions that the loss produces, is necessarily theoretical rather than empirical, and the theoretical understanding is not the same as the empirical one. The untested person tends to believe, with the comfortable confidence of the person who has not yet had the belief tested, that their responses to the hypothetical catastrophe would be approximately the responses they imagine, that they would manage, that they would not be destroyed, that the prior sense of themselves as a capable and resilient person would be confirmed by the experience of the genuine test. Sometimes this belief is correct. Sometimes the test reveals something different, a capacity that exceeded the prior estimate, or a vulnerability that the prior estimate had not accounted for. The belief, either way, is not the knowledge. The knowledge requires the test. The people who rebuilt do not offer this understanding as a critique of the untested. They offer it as the honest description of the difference between their position and the position of the person who has not yet been through the equivalent experience. The difference is real. It is not a difference of worth or of character. It is a difference of information, the information that only the experience provides and that cannot be adequately approximated by the prior reflection on what the experience would be like. They know something the untested do not know yet. They know it from the inside. They carry it with the care that earned knowledge deserves. 86. The final accounting. The accounting that the people who lost everything and rebuilt eventually conduct, the retrospective assessment of what was lost, what was rebuilt, what the rebuilding cost, and what it produced, is, in the testimony of the people who perform it most honestly, not the accounting that the dramatic narrative of the comeback tends to imply. It is not the accounting that concludes with the rebuilt life surpassing the lost life on every relevant measure. It is not the accounting that converts the loss into a necessary prerequisite for the superior version of the existence. It is the honest accounting, the genuine assessment of what was and what came next, held without the pressure to arrive at either the conclusion that the loss was ultimately worth it or the conclusion that the loss was ultimately not. What the honest accounting tends to find is this: the loss was real and its cost was real, and some of what was lost was genuinely valuable and is genuinely absent, and the absence is a genuine diminishment. Alongside this, the rebuilt life is genuinely good, genuinely inhabited, genuinely more aligned with what the person actually is and actually values than the prior life had been allowed to become by its years of accumulated momentum. Both of these things are true. Neither cancels the other. The accounting that holds both without resolving the tension between them is the accounting that most accurately reflects the actual experience. The people who rebuilt do not, in the most honest accounts, conclude that they would choose to have had the loss if the choice had been available. They conclude that they did not have the choice, and that what was built from the unchoosable experience is genuinely good, and that the person who built it is genuinely glad to be the person who built it, and that the gladness and the grief coexist in the way that they have always coexisted in the full account of a fully lived life. 87. The rebuilt self was the real self. The gradual recognition that the person who emerged from the loss and the rebuilding, the changed, tested, clarified, reduced in circumstances but deepened in character person who was inhabiting the rebuilt life was more genuinely themselves than the person who had inhabited the prior life, is one of the most significant and the most quietly transformative discoveries in the testimony. It is not available at the beginning of the rebuilding, when the prior self is still the reference point and the rebuilt self is still in process of becoming. It arrives with time, as the rebuilt self accumulates enough of the rebuilt life to have a genuine character of its own rather than being understood primarily in relation to the prior version. The rebuilt self is more genuinely the person's own because it was built from the genuine values rather than from the accumulated momentum of the prior structure. The prior self had been built over the years of the prior life through the ordinary processes of the adult life, the career that provided the identity, the relationships that provided the social context, the standard of living that provided the material framework. These things had shaped the prior self through the process of being inhabited, producing a self that was partly genuinely chosen and partly the product of the particular circumstances of the particular life that happened to be being lived. The rebuilt self was built from the cleared space, from the position of the genuine question about what to build and why, and for what purpose. The answer to the question, when it was genuinely asked rather than answered by the accumulated momentum of the prior structure, produced a person more deliberately organized around the genuine values, more honestly engaged with the actual interior, more genuinely themselves in the daily practice of the rebuilt existence than the prior version had been in the daily practice of the prior one. The prior self was not false. The rebuilt self was more truly themselves. 88. What they would say to their prior self on the day before the loss. The question of what the rebuilt person would say to the prior self on the day before the loss. The day when the prior life was still intact and the loss was not yet known to be imminent, produces in the testimony one of the most intimate and the most carefully considered answers of the entire account. It is the moment when the testimony is most directly addressed to the person the rebuilt person used to be, and through that person to the people who are currently the prior self, the people living the prior life, the comfortable life, the life that has not yet been tested in the ways the loss will test it. What they would say consistently and without the sentimentality that the question might seem to invite is not the dramatic counsel of the person who knows the catastrophe is coming. It is quieter than that. They would say, the people in the room with you right now are more important than the thing you are currently managing. They would say, the work that feels urgent is less important than the relationship that feels stable, because the stability of the relationship requires the same attention that the urgency of the work is consuming. They would say, the standard of living is not the life. The life is in the moments, and the moments are available right now in the form they are currently in, and they are genuinely good. They would say you are going to be fine, not because the loss will not come, they would not lie about that, and they could not prevent it even if they tried, but because the person you are is more than the things you have assembled around yourself, and the things that get assembled around a person can be lost, and the person remains, and the remaining person is capable of more than you currently believe they are. You are going to be fine. The fine is different from what you currently imagine the fine will look like. It is genuinely fine, you will find out. 89. The unfinished business that became unnecessary. Among the many things that the loss of the prior life removed from the person who went through it, one of the most quietly significant is the list of unfinished businesses, the accumulated items of the prior life that had been in the pending category for months or years, deferred without resolution and maintained in the interior as a low-level background concern that consumed a small but consistent portion of the available attention that the loss simply dissolved, not resolved, dissolved. Made irrelevant by the removal of the context in which they were a relevant category of concern. The unfinished conversation with the colleague about the prior workplace slight, the old grievance with the neighbor about the prior property dispute, the lingering resentment about the outcome of a prior negotiation, the various minor maintenance items of the prior social world that had been deferred to the moment when there was time to address them, and that were, in the conditions of the major loss, simply no longer the kind of thing that required attention. The loss had reorganized the hierarchy of what mattered with a thoroughness that no prior inventory of the unfinished business could have achieved, and the reorganization had moved most of the unfinished items out of the category of things that required attention and into the category of things that had become, from the perspective of the cleared space, genuinely irrelevant. The wisdom this dissolution offers is the wisdom of the inadvertent perspective, the recognition that the prior attachment to the unfinished business was a function of the prior perspective, which was the perspective of a person embedded in the prior context where those items were a relevant category. The loss provided a perspective from which they were not. The perspective is available, to a lesser degree, through the deliberate practice of asking which of the current unfinished items will still seem important from the perspective of the stripped-bare circumstance. Many of them will not. The energy they are consuming is energy that the genuinely important things could use. 90 lessons at 90, the testimony approaches its end. We stand at the 90th lesson, and the full arc of the testimony of the people who lost everything and started over is now almost entirely visible. 10 lessons from the place where the testimony completes itself and leaves the person who received it with what the receiving has provided. In the last 10 lessons, we received the most intimate and the most directly applicable pieces of the account. The words addressed to the person currently in the rubble, the quality of the morning in the rebuilt life, the honest account of hope as the untested person's expectation and the tested person's genuine orientation. We received the relationship between loss and gratitude, the account of what the people who rebuilt know about the untested, the honest final accounting that holds both the genuine cost and the genuine good without resolving the tension between them. We received the recognition that the rebuilt self was more genuinely the real self than the prior version had been. We heard what they would say to the prior self on the day before the loss, and we received the wisdom of the dissolved, unfinished business. 10 lessons remain. They are the final voice of the testimony, the things most worth saying, stated as directly and as honestly as the words allow, in the moment closest to the silence that follows all testimony. The account is nearly complete. This is explored during Sleeping 91, the thing they are most proud of. When the people who lost everything and rebuilt are asked what they are most proud of, not what they rebuilt, not what they achieved in the material or professional or relational dimensions of the rebuilt life, but what they are most proud of about themselves in the full account of what the loss and the rebuilding required of them, the answers do not tend toward the external achievements. They tend toward the interior ones, the things they did not do that the conditions of the loss made it would have been understandable to do, and the things they did do that the conditions of the loss made genuinely difficult. They are proud of having stayed honest in the conditions where the dishonesty was tempting and the honesty was costly, proud of having maintained, in the reduced circumstances of the early rebuilding, a quality of care for the people who depended on them that the conditions were consistently working to make difficult, proud of having asked for help when the cultural expectation was that they should manage without it, proud of having continued, having gotten up the next morning and done the next small thing, and then the next, in the conditions where the continuing required more than the comfortable life had ever required of them. The pride is not the pride of the performance. It is the pride of the person who knows, from the direct experience of having been tested in the conditions that the major loss produced, that they did not simply survive the test, but that they passed it in the ways that mattered most to them, with their honesty intact, with their care for the important people sustained, with their integrity in the conditions where integrity was genuinely costly preserved. The external achievements of the rebuilt life are real and they are valued, but they are the products of what the person was in the conditions of the loss. The person they were in those conditions is the thing they are most proud of. It is the most genuinely theirs. 92. What the rebuilt life most reliably provides. The rebuilt life, described in the testimony of the people who inhabit it with genuine presence and genuine honesty, provides certain things reliably and certain other things not at all. And the honest account of both dimensions is one of the most practically useful pieces of knowledge available from the full testimony. not the idealized account of the rebuilt life as the superior version of everything that was lost, and not the diminished account of the rebuilt life as the lesser version that the loss forced as a substitute. The honest account of what the rebuilt life actually provides to the person who is genuinely in it. What it provides reliably is the quality of presence, the quality of genuine inhabiting of the actual daily existence that the prior life's complexity had been consistently preventing. The rebuilt life is simpler, and the simplicity makes the daily presence more achievable, and the daily presence makes the ordinary goods of the ordinary day more genuinely available to be received rather than merely elapsed. The morning is genuinely inhabited. The relationship is genuinely attended to. The work is genuinely the person's own work rather than the work of the role they were occupying. The alignment between the interior life and the exterior one. The alignment that the comfortable life's accumulated performances had been consistently disrupting is more genuinely available in the rebuilt life than it was in the prior one. What it does not provide is the certainty that the prior life had generated in the comfortable period before the loss, the certainty of the established position, the certainty of the predictable trajectory, the certainty of the social belonging that the prior standing had confirmed. The rebuilt life is lived with the knowledge of the possible loss that the prior comfortable life had been allowing the person to set aside. This knowledge is not comfortable. But it is honest, and the honest relationship with the possible loss produces, in the rebuilt person's daily experience, something that the comfortable avoidance of that knowledge was preventing, the genuine appreciation of what is present while it is present. The rebuilt life is genuinely good. The goodness is held with the realistic awareness that it is not guaranteed. The awareness is what makes the holding genuine. 93. The one request. The one request that the people who lost everything and rebuilt most consistently make of the person who receives this testimony. Not the counsel, not the practical advice, not the philosophical position, but the single direct request from one human being to another is this: do not wait. Do not wait for the loss to teach you what the loss teaches. Do not wait for the stripped-bare circumstances to reveal the foundation, because the revelation of the foundation is not worth the stripping if the stripping can be avoided. Do not wait for the loss of the important people to discover their importance. Do not wait for the removal of the ordinary goods to discover their value. Do not wait for the loss of the time to discover what the time was worth. The discovery is available earlier. The loss is not required for it. What the loss provides is not a lesson that is unavailable without it. It is a lesson that the comfortable life makes it possible to defer indefinitely, and the deferral is the problem that the loss solves by ending the deferral. The request is the request of the person who paid the price of the deferral and who would like the person receiving this testimony to consider not paying it. Look at the people in the room with you right now. Look at the morning. Look at the ordinary day. The things that the loss would make visible are visible now if the looking is genuine rather than theoretical. The foundation is available now. If the person is willing to stand on it without first requiring the removal of everything else to demonstrate its solidity, the rebuilt life that the people who lost everything found in the rubble is not exclusive to the rubble. The quality it embodies, the genuine inhabiting of the genuine present, is available in the prior life to the person who looks for it with the same honesty that the loss forced. Do not wait for the loss. Look now. The foundation is there. It was always there. You are standing on it. 94. What they know about the future that the rubble obscures. The person standing in the rubble, in the period immediately following the loss, when everything that was built is gone, and the future exists only as the unknown space beyond the current position, cannot see what the people who have been through the equivalent experience and have rebuilt can see from the distance of the rebuilt life. The future that the rubble's proximity makes impossible to perceive, and that the distance of the subsequent years makes visible with the clarity that retrospective knowledge always provides. What the people who rebuilt can see from their current position, looking back at the rubble they stood in and forward at the rebuilt life they constructed from it, is the future that was present in the rubble even when it was not visible. The rebuilt relationships, the clarified values, the creative work that the prior life had been suppressing, the quality of the daily presence that the simplification made achievable, the self-knowledge that the testing produced. These things were in the future of the person standing in the rubble. They were not visible from the rubble. The rubble's proximity obscured them the way that the face of a mountain obscures the view from its base. The view is available, but only from a position that cannot be occupied without the climbing that the base does not yet make possible. The knowledge that the people who rebuilt want to offer the person in the rubble is not the knowledge of what the specific future holds. They cannot know that, and the specific future of the person in the rubble will be their own rather than a reproduction of the rebuilt person's. It is the knowledge of the structure of the situation, that the rubble is the base of the mountain rather than the whole of the landscape, that the view from the rebuilt life is genuinely good, and that the path from where the person currently stands to the position from which the view is available is traversable. They traversed it. It was hard. It was traversable. The person in the rubble will traverse it too. 95. The relationship between the loss and the life it made possible. The honest account of the relationship between the loss and the life that the loss made possible, the life that would not have been built if the loss had not cleared the space in which it was built, is one of the most carefully and most honestly addressed subjects in the final portion of the testimony, carefully addressed because it is the subject most vulnerable to the specific oversimplifications of the inspirational narrative that the testimony most consistently resists. The oversimplification presents the loss as the necessary precondition for the superior life. The loss had to happen so that the better thing could be built. This framing is not honest. The loss did not have to happen. The better thing might have been built in some form without it, through the gradual development of the clarity and the values that the loss forced, through the deliberate practice of the genuine inhabiting that the loss made necessary, through the voluntary simplification that the loss imposed involuntarily. The loss was not necessary for the rebuilt life. It was sufficient for it. The distinction matters. What the honest relationship between the loss and the rebuilt life acknowledges is that the loss was the occasion of the rebuilt life's construction, that the clearing of the prior space was the condition under which the rebuilt life became possible, not because the loss was a gift, but because the clearing was a fact, and the person was still there, and the person's continued presence in the cleared space was the beginning of the building. The loss made the space. The person made the life. Both things are true. The relationship between them is the relationship of the occasion and the response, the loss as occasion, the rebuilding as response, the rebuilt life as the product of the response to the occasion that was not chosen. The response was chosen. What was built from the response was genuinely built. It belongs to the person who built it. 96. The final simplification. The testimony of the people who lost everything and started over, taken as a whole and reduced to its single most essential finding, comes down to simplification that is as available before the loss as after it, as accessible to the person in the comfortable life as to the person in the rubble, and that requires for its reception only the genuine willingness to hear it rather than the experience of the loss that so many of the people who received it most completely were required to go through first. The simplification is this: the life is now, not the life that was, not the life that will be when the circumstances improve or the rebuilding completes or the pain recedes to the manageable background level that the comfortable life produces. Now, the actual, present, immediately available life, with its specific goods and its genuine difficulties and its irreplaceable particular quality of being this day rather than any other, is the life, the only life. The one being spent in the living of it, whether or not the living of it is receiving the attention it deserves. The people who lost everything learned this through the loss of the things they had been living for rather than in. The house was not the life. The career was not the life. The accumulated standing and the maintained standard of living were not the life. The life was the actual daily experience of being alive, which was happening continuously and which the management of all the other things was consistently drawing the attention away from. The loss ended the management. The ending revealed the life. The revelation was the most important thing the loss provided, and the most important counsel the people who rebuilt can offer is that the revelation does not require the loss. It requires the looking. The looking is available now. The life is available now. It was always available. It is available right now. Look. 97. The letter they would write. If the people who lost everything and rebuilt could write one letter addressed to the next person who will lose everything, who is not yet known, and who may be reading these words in their own aftermath, the letter would not be long. The things most worth saying, when the experience of the long journey has distilled them to their essence, tend to be shorter than the years it took to learn them. The letter would say, "You are not alone in this. Every person who has lost what you have lost has stood where you are standing in the cleared space, with the rubble around them and nothing yet built, and no evidence available from inside the current moment that the building is possible. The building is possible. You will build it, not today, not quickly, but genuinely from the materials that the loss has left you, which are more than you currently believe they are." It would say the foundation is you. The house was not the foundation. The career was not the foundation. The person you were before the loss was not the foundation. The person was supported by the things that are now gone, and the things that supported the person were mistaken for the person's foundation, but they were not the foundation. The foundation is what you are standing on right now, the bare ground, the cleared space, the self that is still there, improbable and imperfect and sufficient. You are the foundation. The foundation is solid. Everything that can genuinely be built will be built on it. And it would say, last and most simply, the ordinary morning on the other side of this, the unremarkable Tuesday, the warm cup, the light in the ordinary room is genuinely good. It is worth the getting there. You will get there. Not because the path is easy, it is not easy, but because you are the kind of person who takes the next small step. And the next small step, taken once and then again, is how all rebuilding is done. Take the next small step. The path is longer than you want it to be. The destination is worth it. We will see you there. 98. What they are now. The person who lost everything and rebuilt is not the person who entered the experience. They are not the prior self recovered from the conditions of the loss and restored to the prior condition. They are the product of the full arc of what happened, the prior self. Plus the loss, plus the rebuilding, plus the years of the rebuilt life lived with the quality of presence and the clarity of values that the experience produced. The full product of all of this is a person who is more genuinely themselves, more honestly engaged with the actual daily life, more capable of the genuine connection that the vulnerability made possible, more in possession of the self-knowledge that the testing installed, and more deeply appreciative of the ordinary goods of the ordinary day than the prior self, in the comfortable conditions of the prior life, had been capable of being. This is not the claim that the experience was good, or that the loss was worth it, or that the rebuilt person is superior to the person who was not required to be tested in the same way. It is the honest description of what the experience produced in the person who went through it, not as a justification of the cost, but as the accurate account of the product. The product is real. The person who lost everything and rebuilt is carrying things that the comfortable life does not produce and that are genuinely worth carrying. The knowledge of the survivable worst case, the clarity about what actually matters, the depth of the genuine connections, the quality of the genuine daily presence, and the foundation of the self-knowledge that the testing made available. They are changed. The change is permanent. The permanent change is, in the honest assessment of the people who carry it, one they would not choose to undo, not because the cost was not real, but because what was built from the cost is genuinely theirs, genuinely good, and genuinely the product of the full and particular and irreplaceable life they have lived. 99. The return to the ordinary. The return that the rebuilt life ultimately represents, not the dramatic comeback, not the surpassing of the prior position, not the vindication of the prior ambitions, is the return to the ordinary. The return to the unremarkable Tuesday. The return to the morning cup and the ordinary light and the relationship that is there when you wake up and there when you sleep, and that is, in its ordinary daily presence, the thing that everything else was for. The return to the life that is genuinely being lived rather than managed, genuinely inhabited rather than performed, genuinely available in its actual present form to the person who is present enough in it to receive it. This is not a small thing. It presents itself as a small thing, the ordinary morning, the unremarkable Tuesday, the modest rebuilt life that does not invite comparison with anything that would make it appear impressive. But it is not a small thing. It is the thing that the loss revealed to have been the actual life all along. The specific, particular, irreplaceable daily existence that the comfortable life had been obscuring with its management and its obligations and its accumulated momentum. And that the loss, by removing the obscuring, made visible as the thing itself. The bare, genuine, ordinary life that is genuinely good when it is genuinely received. The return is not the end of the journey. The journey does not end. What the return provides is the position from which the journey can continue in the genuine form, the form of the actual life of the actual person, inhabited with the full presence that the experience of the loss and the rebuilding produced, oriented toward the genuine values that the clearing revealed, and held with the gentle, honest, grateful awareness that the ordinary morning is the thing itself, the whole thing, the life in the form it actually takes when it is finally, genuinely seen. 100. What the rebuilding leaves. Close your eyes, breathe slowly. Let the darkness around you become the darkness of the space between the lost and the found, the darkness that is not the ending but the pause before the beginning, the darkness that every person who has ever stood in the rubble of their prior life has stood in, and that every person who has ever started over has had to cross. We have arrived together at the 100th lesson. We have traveled in these 100 entries through the full testimony of the people who lost everything and built again, through the solid bottom and the revealed foundation, the people who stayed and the people who did not, the nonlinear path and the longer timeline and the small step taken in the dark, through the discovery of the sufficient self and the clarified values and the creative capacity the prior life had been covering, through the rebuilt relationships and the dissolved performances and the returned joy, through the honest accounting and the final simplification and the letter to the next person who will stand in the same rubble. What the rebuilding leaves, what the full experience of the loss and the starting over deposits in the person who goes through it and carries it forward into the rebuilt existence, is not primarily what the dramatic narrative of the comeback tends to celebrate. It is not the restored position or the surpassed prior achievement or the vindicated ambition. It is something quieter and more durable, the knowledge of the foundation. The direct, empirical, fully embodied knowledge that the person is the foundation of their own life, that the foundation is solid, and that the life built on it, however modest, however different from the life that was lost, however imperfect and incomplete and genuinely good, is worth the building. The loss was real, the cost was real, the journey was longer than it should have had to be and harder than the person deserved and more clarifying than anything else available could have been. The person who walked out of the rubble carrying what the rubble gave them is carrying something that the comfortable life, for all its genuine goods, does not produce. They know who they are without the things that define them. They know what matters without the abundance that made the question avoidable. They know the ordinary morning is genuinely good without the loss that makes the good visible. They know, above all, that they are still there, still capable, still the foundation, still genuinely able to build something worth having from whatever the current clearing contains. You are still there, you are the foundation. The foundation is solid, build. Sleep now, let the testimony settle into the quiet of the night. What was said here was true, and it was earned, and it belongs to anyone who receives it with the honesty it was offered with. This is explored during sleeping.